morning, everybody. Thank you for all coming in and taking your seats. We're starting a little behind time this morning. Parking, traffic, it's a thing. I'd like to acknowledge that we're gathering today on Wadawurrung country, and what a beautiful morning it has been. I pay my respects to the traditional owners of this place and acknowledge that their custodianship has been careful and considered over many, many thousands of years. I pay a particular welcome to any First Nations people who are in the audience today. It is my great pleasure to welcome to the stage Monsieur Gabriel Gaté. It rhymes with pâté. Yes. Just discovered.
That's the easiest way for people to remember my name.
I've learnt a few things about Gabriel in the past in this GrAiNZ gathering. Firstly, he's a fabulous dinner companion, but I will give you a proper introduction. Gabriel trained as a cuisinier with some of the best French chefs of his generation in several of the top restaurants in France and England. He arrived in Australia in 1977 with his Australian wife Angie, and soon after, Gabriel began to freelance as a chef consultant, cooking demonstrator, teacher, writer and broadcaster. He is one of Australia's best-selling cookery authors. He has 24 cookbooks, having sold well over 1 million copies. His latest book is So French, So Sweet. Gabriel has presented cookery shows on television for the last 45 years, an amazing career. His credits include The Good Food Show on SBS and What's Cooking on the 9 Network. More recently, and for 15 years, Gabriel has produced and fronted the popular cooking segment Taste le Tour with Gabriel Gaté for SBS TV, featuring the most talented chefs, pastry chefs and bakers, the best food, wines and gastronomy of France. And this was the piece of information I was a bit gobsmacked to hear as we dined together the night before last, that I was enjoying a meal with such a celebrity. Several generations of chefs and home cooks have been inspired by Gabriel's cooking and food philosophy, and he is often referred to as the original TV master chef in Australia. So with that, I'd like you to welcome Gabriel Gaté, and I'll pass over the floor to you.
Thank you very much. I have met some of you in the last few days, and wasn't it the smoking ceremony quite something the other night? It was really, really good to be linked to the country where we live, where we have a good life. Where we have a very good life. Well, we are very lucky. Yes, I've been a chef for 52 years. Seems like a long time. It goes so fast. I'm reading a book at the moment about people that were in concentration camp, and they said that one day is very slow, but 1 week was very fast. And life is very fast. Within us, we have sometimes many opportunities. We need to find the key to those opportunities, and sometimes we need other people to help us. I've been very lucky. I've had a wonderful career. And I think that sometimes I've had such a long career, because it has been a long career. You know, I did my apprenticeship at 16, worked in the Loire Valley in a 1 Michelin star restaurant. So it was very lucky to start at a really high level of cooking. I always feel sorry for people that learn to cook or baking if they work in a place where the standards are very low. Because to change from a very low standard to a high standard can be very, very demanding, very difficult. But once you get used to a standard of cooking with very fresh food, cooking with the best possible within your area, using the best technique, learning the choreography of the movements, there's a big in cooking, like in baking, like in a lot of skills, there's a choreography of movement. And the choreography of movement is doing the minimum movement for the maximum effect. Because when you are a chef and you cook all day, especially if you are my age, you would be very tired very quickly if you do the wrong movements, because you would work twice as much as if your movement was fluid and efficient. So that choreography of movement, to start with, you definitely learn from other people. And there is a memory. I think the most important aspect in our profession is our memory. The memory of movement, the memory of flavor. Sometimes we cook for a little while and you have not, you have wasted a moment, of course, and that's important. And then suddenly you have finished something, like if, by magic, it has happened because of your memory of movement. Sometimes you smell something, you say, this is ready. It's ready in the oven, the smell. The look in the pan, what's the texture. You don't need to measure all the time or, have the thermometer or things like that. So I did my apprenticeship on the Loire Valley. I came from a family that loved food, seriously loved food. My grandmother, who lived with us, she had been a private cook in a family, and so was a sister. A sister worked in Paris for the Rothschild family. So those women, they were really cooking every day for a number of people with what was fresh, going to the market. My grandmother worked in a mill, in a flour mill. That's interesting, on the side of the river. And she was cooking every day for, like 15 to 20 people, the staff, the family, the children. There was lots of fish in the river. At that time, my grandmother didn't have, she had a notebook, spent lots of time with her. She inspired me. She was really my mentor. That's what we are talking about today. Because she was very lovely. She was very lovely, and she had a tough life, really tough life. She was born in 1894. She got a job at 13 in that family, helping in the kitchen. She was there for like 7 years. She married in 1914. Her husband went to the war and never came back. So she went back to work, and she was there for another 10 years. She became the head cook. And the memory was very important, and of course they would have had people, sharing information. But she encouraged us when we were young to contribute to the family cooking and to take part in a positive way. I think this is really, really important. I will tell you, when you talk like that about a theme, the hope is to plant the seeds, plant the grains, and I can imagine your mind is ticking. I'm saying something that appeals to you, some of it, and then you start thinking about what you may do yourself. So we are planting the seeds today. It will be up to you to water them if you want to reap the fruits of this session. The definition of mentoring is when someone shares their knowledge, skills, and experience with another person to help them progress. So there's lots of lovely words. You give the power to someone to progress, you help them, you share what you know. It is very much like parenting, really, when you think of it. Parenting, the most interesting definition of parenting is when you give independence to your kids as early as possible in your life. so they can do things by themselves without you. And mentoring is a bit like that. You share what you know, you give the power, and you let people do. You don't do it for them. It's not like when you have an essay and you have someone doing it for you. It was interesting, someone last night, don't know if it was you, Kate, someone else was saying, the night before, was saying that years ago when people, when it was difficult to learn, like in my case, as a young apprentice, I worked with an amazing chef, technically amazing. There's been 3 generations of chefs in his family, Michelin star chefs. And, but it was, the way of communication is not as good as what it is now. The chefs didn't communicate very well. It was, like the model of the kitchen was very much like the model of the army. It was really like that. Escoffier, which was a brilliant chef, that great French chef that lived in England and in France, he established a hierarchy in the kitchen and with sections, and amazing organizer, and that was very, very good. But not many of those chefs, including me in some ways, we were not as educated as we could have been, because you started early. The restaurant lacked to very young chefs because they could get what they wanted out of them. But they were not very good communicators, so you really had to struggle to try to look at what they were doing. There was no scientific explanation of why there was a reaction when you made a mayonnaise, or when you beat egg white into stiff peak. There was no explanation of why the bubbles of air were trapped in the white, and why the soufflé rise, and all of that. You just learn. But the bonus was that because it was difficult, and because the movement was repeated so often, that it stayed into your memory. And some people are saying now that with the ease of getting information, and it is very easy now to get information on the net, but they say it doesn't stay as much as when you had to do that movement. They often talk for artists, to have worked for 10,000 hours before you master something. When you work in a bakery, you do get those 10,000 hours in 3 years. And I always tell, I have been a chef for 52 years, but my first few years, because we started my apprenticeship, the first job was to put charcoal in the oven. The first 2 restaurants I worked at started in 1971. It was operating with charcoal, so that was the first thing to do, was to start the stove, and then before 7 o'clock in the morning, because we had to cook breakfast for the few guests in the country hotel restaurant. And then you finished like at 11 o'clock at night. Sometimes you had a break in the afternoon, sometimes you didn't have. So an apprenticeship of 3 years, it was like working for 6 years in a normal situation. So you did learn a lot. Also, what was interesting in that period is that you got the fish, the whole fish with the guts and everything. You got the pheasants, the wild food with the feathers, the turkey. When it was Christmas, you had to buy turkey, and you did that in the afternoons. You got the hills, so nothing was processed, and practically everything was local. You didn't get, in my region, we didn't get fish from the Mediterranean region. I'm from the Loire Valley. We got fish from the river, the wild Atlantic salmon. It was caught wild by local fishermen. We cooked lots of local fish, the local vegetables, the local fruits. We got fish from the ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, which was not very far. It only took 2 hours for a truck to come. So we would order at the end of the service. We would sometimes give a phone call and say we need 10 sols and 3 turbot for tomorrow, and it would be dropped at the door the next morning in ice. So a tutor, a mentor is a person that is competent, ideally, someone that you meet. There's 3 types of mentors. There's a one-to-one mentor, and that's usually someone you meet, possibly in a situation like this, someone that that comes to your shop, a friend. That person is usually very kind. There's a fair bit of compassion in it. There's lots of goodwill. That person usually doesn't charge. It's just done like that. I have had many mentors. I know, for example, you may, if you are in Victoria, there's a chef called Philippe Mouchel. He's a really seriously good French chef. He worked with Paul Bocuse, and he's 1 year younger than me. And we have been, I think, mentors for each other. He's really the chef that has spent all his life in the kitchen. Many more hours of movement than me. I have spent a lot of hours in the kitchen testing for cookbooks and things like that, but in a different way. But I've learned to communicate probably a little bit more easily than him, because he is so much in his kitchen, so much with his movement. And we developed a friendship, and we did lots of filming together, where I would film some of his recipes and interviewing and things like that. And I think we have been, we have the friendship where we can give a phone call to each other, and I would say, why do we always put garlic, when we cook with red wine? That kind of thing. And he would probably know the answer, that kind of thing. Those little technical questions that I still have, even after 52 years of cooking and writing 24 cookbooks, demonstrating more than 2,000 recipes on television, and joining. I have joined lots of classes over the years. I used to go to lots of Elizabeth Chong cooking classes. At some stage, we had a cooking school where we had teachers from as many countries as possible, because it's, as a chef, you really need to understand, master the mix of spices. As a French chef, French cuisine basically is extremely subtle. It's a beautiful cuisine. It's a cuisine that you can't have in a very noisy place. That's an interesting concept. People, for example, that eat in the food courts in shopping centers, they always choose food that are more salty and sweeter. If I cook some of my fine dishes in a shopping center, for example, I have a dish that I've always done, that I created like 40 years ago, a scallop and carrot soup, where I start with, I chop some shallots, just cook the shallots slightly in a little bit of butter, not much, minimum butter. Then I put some grated carrot, I sweat the carrots, I put a little bit of wine, bring that to the bowl, a bit of stock or water, and then I drop the scallops in it and just poach them. Extremely simple, extremely delicious. The scallops must not be overcooked. Okay, that's the key. If I serve that in the shopping center, people will say it doesn't taste like anything. They would add this and that and chili and things. If you serve that in a quiet room with your friends, 6 people, 8 people, people would say, this is really delicious. So this is French cuisine at its best. But I'm fascinated by all kinds of cuisine, by the traditions, by the story. And I think as professionals, we need to look at something else than what we do every day. And I think traveling, that's really where I wanted to go. Traveling is one of the things that has given me the most inspiration, no doubt. Going to foreign countries, tasting food, feeling free from the kitchen routine, talking to people, even going to the market. I go to at least 1 or 2 markets a week. The inspiration you get, suddenly you see, oh, those mushrooms, it's time for me to cook them. If you go to the shopping centers, the supermarket, you might be able to cook fresh food, that is okay, but the markets really give you that seasonal thing, that ingredients that you have not used before, the chestnuts that Australians are still not cooking very much, the wild mushrooms that Australians are still not cooking very much, the artichokes that Australians still can't prepare, that chefs don't know how to prepare. All those things that are wonderful, extraordinary food. The multitude of varieties of asparagus that are extraordinary in spring, that are celebrated in Europe, especially the white asparagus and the green asparagus. So a one-to-one mentor is certainly my favorite way of going. But I got lots of one-to-one mentor. When I was a young chef, my chef was famous. He was already doing a bit of television and things like that. But he was a very strong person, and he used to say, I won't send you to college. In theory, we had to go once a week, an afternoon a week, to college to learn what you don't learn in the restaurant you work, basically. That's the basic techniques. And at that time, he said, no, they're going to teach you stupid things there. So actually never, ever went to college during my apprenticeship. Never. So therefore, I missed on some techniques that you don't learn in the restaurant you work, although there was lots of techniques, like we made puff pastry, choux pastry, we made sweet pastry, savory pastry, we made ice creams. So there was lots of techniques, but there's other things that you miss. And the other kind of mentorship is when there's a mentor, sorry for my pronunciation, a mentor for a large group of people. A little bit like this, a little bit like if you join a course at the Gordon College, a little bit of all the demonstrations that are happening with GrAiNZ today, where someone that is kind, someone that is happy to share his knowledge is going to empower people with some little techniques. Sometimes you go to a demonstration and you just learn a small details that becomes really important for you. Cooking is a big puzzle. It's a never-ending puzzle because there is always so much to learn. With writing for magazine, I was the food editor for Better Homes and Garden. I was writing all the recipes for the magazine for about 6 years, where I had to do an enormous amount of research and do that. And after all that experience, I still feel that I know so very little, because musicians are dealing with whatever number of notes. We are dealing with thousands of ingredients, with millions of possible, concoctions that can be all delicious if you know how to make it. So the group mentoring, that's easy. And then there's a distance mentoring, which has become more and more prominent, with the internet, with the classes online, with things you can learn from a distance, which I think is really important. Even Instagram, social media, can be, you can learn a lot. I have enjoyed watching recipes on social media. And it is interesting how dishes, when I started to be a chef, basically there was still a little bit the attitude of there's only one way to make bœuf bourguignon. onion, little bacon, brown the meat, do this, do that, the wine. Now we know that there's many, many ways, many variations. And I think that I must mention two mentors that has been very important in my life, because we all need to find our niche. My niche, apart from being able to communicate, sharing what I knew with people, which I think was probably within me, but I have taught sometimes people to present, to introduce what they know well. Because every professional, everyone in this room, even if you're just passionate and making some bread at home and you really want to talk about it, you have got to find the words that are really important within you to express what you want to share. Because there's lots of frustrated professionals because they are so busy in their head. But I think being able to express in words, with a smile, with relaxation, it doesn't matter if from time to time we make a fool of ourselves. We make a fool of ourselves every day, at least once, somewhere. But that communication is really important, especially if you want to find mentors that are going to embrace you. Because there is what we call the law of attraction. The law of attraction is amazing. Sometimes I've been working on a book. I was working on a book years ago that didn't sell much because nobody cared that much. People care, but it could not be marketed properly. How to teach kids to cook, which was basically encouraging them from when they are very little. Those 3 or 4 little kids that we see wandering around. That's when you entice them to put the apple on the cake, hold the bowl, stir. Lots of parents, think that it is when they are teenagers that they are going to teach them to cook. Forget it. Teenagers, but at that time they don't give they're sick of their parents. But I remember to write that book, I really wanted it to have a sense of correct psychology to the approach, And I remember talking to a friend, Rob Moody. We wrote a book together later on. And he says, go and see that guy. He's a professor of education at Monash. I would never have thought. And I went to see him, and he knew all the layers of the way to approach children, the way to get results, the way to encourage them, to make them stay with you, to make it playful, things like that. So this is really that law of attraction. What I'm saying is that if you want to find mentors, or if you have got to attract them to you by your behavior, by going a little bit forwards. Sometimes they will just be there by magic when you need them. Definitely, it has happened to me many times, but you need to do that. So the mentors is patient. This is really important, to be patient. If you are mentoring or if you are being mentored, you need to be patient. You need to listen, and you need to answer the questions that people are asking you. And you need to give the mentees the power so they can find the solutions to their own problems. I am going to talk a few minutes about this book, Recipes for a Great Life, that I wrote with Rob Moody. Rob Moody is a mentor to me, He's an amazing guy. He's a doctor. He was the head of Vic Health at some stage. He's He was a Médecins Sans Frontières. He's a professor of global health. So he goes in countries and organizes health system for those poor countries, mentoring doctors and things like that. And one of our sons went to school. Two of our sons went to school together. We became friends, and we decided to write a book together, like 15 years ago, because we felt that in our life there is lots of dimensions. Sometimes when you're a baker, there's dimension which is making bread and being in the bakery early in the morning. The same as a chef. And when last night I was thinking about that because you're aware, the MasterChef judge joke that died, when was it, on Sunday night or something, Monday morning. And I knew him, brilliant chef, wonderful chef. His mentor was Marco Pierre White, and he often talked about how Marco, with even his teaching was not always gentle, made him think of something else than his demons. And so in our life, I think it's so important to have a balance. I think that has been my savior. Not that I was a troubled person, but you tend to become so obsessed with your profession that you can neglect your family, you can neglect your health. And I think that's, as professional, even if we think that our job is the most important thing in the world, because we think sometimes that we are changing the world, saving the world, we are contributing, there's no doubt. It's important to contribute just around you. If you contribute around you, you are contributing for the world. So the balance, so we decided to, in our many meetings, lots of cups of coffees, we decided to list the things that are important in our life. Okay. To start with, we know that we are social beings. Humans are social beings. So we need other people to nourish us. We nourish them, we exchange. Really important to have social beings. Sometimes it can be professional socials, can be friends. The food, of course, is very important. For me, the food has, of course, been major, but I worked with a chef called Alain Sanderins when I was in my early 20s. It was a 3-star Michelin star in Michelin in Paris, as top as you could go, modern, and very creative. So he was a chef, a modern chef, that says you need to express your feeling into foods. You need to have a constant evolution. And when my clients come to my 3-star restaurants, top restaurants, I don't want them to feel unwell when they leave my restaurants. He was in the middle of Paris. He used to say, I want them to go for a walk in the street and go on the Champs-Élysées and, sit at the terrace and after dinner rather than going home and says, oh gosh, that was delicious, but I feel so sick. So the responsibility in our professions, there's a big element of health. My job as a chef is to nourish in a positive way with delicious food. So the health aspect needs to be important because the people that you nourishing are going to be healthier. So the food is important. Many years ago, I wrote books for the Cancer Council. I was commissioned at the time because I always approached the family as, teaching, introducing your kids to a wide variety of food. And I wrote those 3 books for them that the 3 books together sold 500,000 copies. So that was really enormous sales, like it was the best sellers of that time, simply because I didn't make it too complicated with technical terms and folate and this and that and this and that. It was simply eat a wide variety of food, of fresh food, wide variety. So vegetables from different colors, from different textures, from different seasons, fresh as possible, okay? No need to be obsessed, completely obsessed, and, just cook, no. So eat a wide variety of food. Limit salt and sugar. We need to be careful. The top pâtissier in my country, in France, the top creators, they are really cutting down on sugar dramatically. They're cutting down on the serve size. I'm never someone that doesn't want to taste something. I became a chef because I love food. But if you are served a slice of cake that is 3 times bigger than it should be, you're not helping anybody. So continue to make your very delicious, rich, interesting things, but if it's the case, the serve needs to be smaller. It needs to be easy to digest. I know at my age that I know when something is not quite right because my system tells me much more than when I was younger, where you just shovel things in. As the more the merrier. So the food, limit smoked food. There's big movement to smoke this and smoke that. You need to be careful with all that food that is smoked and cured with lots of salt and things like that. Need to be careful. Moderation. And learn to cook. I think the most important thing, one of the most important things in our life is to learn to cook well. Definitely. So with kids, give them the basics. Teach them to make a salad dressing. Teach them to mix a few ingredients, to do basic things. It doesn't need to be very sophisticated, but give them the joys of cooking so they will become independent. Everyone can cook. So in my work, I've always been very conscious of my next step. You need to have an evolution in your work. If I can mentor you, just don't keep doing the same things, because at some stage you'll get bored and you'll be totally passé and things like that. So I wrote the first book. My first book was French Cuisine for Australians. Okay, so it was basically French cuisine using Australian ingredients, which we self-published. We just survived. We paid for the printing. Nobody wanted to print a book. I was living in Adelaide at that time. I went to see, bookshops and publishers in Melbourne and said, oh no, we have better chefs in Melbourne. So that was the end of the story. So we published with my wife, and we survived. The second book was Family Food, because it was important that a decision is taken at the family level. The Anti-Cancer Council tell me there's evidence that if we don't eat a balanced food, if we eat too much of certain food, we are more at risk of cancers. Okay, so at that time, everyone was focusing on all the people that were getting the cancers, and I said no. It's very difficult to change an older person. You can, of course. People change when their doctors tell them you have got, if you continue like that, you'll be dead in 2 years. So people sometimes stop smoking or doing this or that. But otherwise, it's prevention. So you put good seeds with your kids to eat a wide varieties. I am aware, kids are fussy, okay? There's lots of fussy eaters. I think, it's hard for me to say that sometimes, but I think there's more fussy eaters in Australia than there's in Europe and in Asia, where the food is placed on the table, because there's all that complexity, this and that. It's made too complicated. It should be much more simpler than that. So that food is really important. Exercise, and we covered that, it is so important to exercise. Someone that I met this morning, that person may be here, she said, what's important for you now in your life? And I said, well, what's important is to walk every day. Walking is the best thing. You talk to wise people, you know, and they say, of everything, walking regularly is a good thing. And mentoring and walking is wonderful. What I'm saying, you have a good friend, you have someone you admire in a place like this, go for a walk. Walk 6 kilometers together. You will see the conversation, if you focus on what you want to know, is wonderful. It has been proven, there is an element of when your body is actually working, you know, something are released where you are open, where you are relaxed, where you are breathing. So walking is important. Another aspect in our life, of course, in terms of exercise, is breathing. Totally underestimated. Breathing is really everything. When you are stressed, you know, to go back to your breathing, to meditate on your breathing, to do what they call the triangle breathing. There's lots of techniques, you know, where you breathe in for 5 seconds, breathe out for 5 seconds, and then for 5 seconds, you don't breathe in or out. Or the technique to go to sleep in the middle of the night, it's a bit of the same, where you breathe in for 4 seconds, keep your breathing still, you know, don't breathe in or out for 7 seconds, and breathe out for 8 seconds. This is what I use when when you get older, you wake up at night. Some people can't sleep. I'm lucky I sleep. To go to the loo, and getting back can be tricky if you start thinking, and that technique puts me back to sleep. Not 100% of the time, but 80% of the time. So that breathing is extremely important. I have a mentor that I met by accident. I met a French guy. I'm still friends with him. I visit him practically every week in a nursing home. He's almost 93. He's got dementia. He was the first tenor at the Paris Opera. And I met him at a French function about 25 years ago. And he had seen me on television, and I knew of him. And he came to Australia, circumstances. And he was teaching singing. He had a technique, you know, where you, a particular technique of breathing to get the notes, because singing it's like a wind instrument. You need to have, if you don't breathe properly, you can't get the sound going. So he had a technique where you visualize, you know, and you breathe from the back of your back, and then you let it go up, the breathing, and you go with your hands. And then you, and so I was talking to him, and he says, oh, you talk in public? He said, why don't you come? I'll give you a few classes so you can be less nervous and help you. Because he said, you know, when you talk in public, the most important thing is that a few minutes or a few seconds before you speak is to go back to your breathing. This is really important, that breathing thing, totally underestimated. I know it may seem totally out of what the topic is, but it's not. It's not, because we need to have all those dimensions in our life. Another dimension that we covered is we need to have some artistic activities, especially if we are professionals. If you make bread, it might be, it might be good to do something else that is making bread is the art of making bread. It's an art. The texture, you constructing something, you are making something that is quite amazing. Cooking is the same, the art of cooking. With some ingredients, you have results. You please people with them. And I think it's good for everybody to learn to, I'm sorry, I hope you could hear me when the microphone, to learn to do other art forms. It can be anything. It can be poetry, it can be music, it can be singing, it can be, because I think there's lots of similarities between different art forms. I know, for example, that I've always been interested in singing. I'm not a great singer. My voice is okay, but I just enjoy joining. But I know that there's a lot of similarities between running an orchestra and running a kitchen now. You know, like years ago, the kitchen, as I mentioned before, was based on the army. So the chef said, you do this. Then the sous chef told someone else, you do this, and you do that, and don't ask questions, just do it. The orchestra, the kitchen or the bakery, there's an issue there compared to an orchestra. A top orchestra, all the musicians are top musicians, okay? But the conductor needs to make sure that those musicians are playing the same tune at the same time. The top conductor makes sure that his musicians practice that music and understand it and understand the feeling and the emotions of the music. So together it comes as something quite amazing. And the kitchen is the same now. We need the kitchen, the chef, the chief baker, need to really mentor their people, so everybody from that younger person or the beginner gets to the level of your business as quickly as possible, so it can work as a team. Of course, the young person might not be in charge of proofing the croissant, because that's tricky, or shaping the baguette if you have got to do it by hand. But that young person will start at the beginning and get to a level where he measures or she measures the quantity of flour and water exactly to what you need. So the orchestra and the kitchen are very much similar. You need to have a team of people that works together for the same cause with a smile on their face. You need to help them, be happy in their work. There's a lot more that I could say. As you can see, I'm not reading notes. So maybe we can have a little time of questions. And if I can't answer the question, someone else in this room, because there's so much intelligence in this room, might be able to answer. Any questions? Yeah.
You spoke before just about, the old-fashioned way of running kitchens, like the army and the hierarchy.
Yeah.
That was how I sort of trained in kitchens as well. But since then, over the past sort of 10 years, I think we've all probably seen a pretty big shift in the way that, people are run and staff are treated and this and that. And I wondered if you had any thoughts on that, and whether that hierarchical training model is still relevant or still current, and how we can, use the best of the past and the best of the future as well, because nobody likes it when you wet their tea towel behind their back or put their tongues in the fryer anymore.
Yeah, but no, you are right. I mean, I was trained, I worked in some kitchens where it was violent on occasions, I was lucky at two older brothers that teach me to look after myself. No, but seriously, that's why. It has changed. There is still a lot of work to do, a lot of progression to do. The nature of restaurants has changed a lot. When I was young, we were all working more or less on classic dishes, even with a little bit of modernity in it. Now there's often a chef that is very creative at the top level. So he's the only one that knows his cooking. It's very hard. Like if you go to work to places like Vue de Monde or Benchery, those places, it's the cooking of the chef. So that's really important for the chef to share. As I said, you know, it's like a new piece of music where the conductor is going to teach. So the communication is important, the kindness is important, the encouragement, the humor at work is important. And also, I think we need to be very careful in the language we use. When I worked in London, I worked at the Savoy Company in the Berkeley Hotel. Everything was fucking this, fucking that. It was maybe a way of friendship at the time, you could see, but I think you need to be very careful with the kind of language you use, because at the end it's not very healthy. You really need to avoid, occasionally you can, you know, have a swear word, you know, it's human, it's okay, but not, so the language you use, the clarity of what you do, the training of your people, you really need to train your people. It is the weakness of most business. The most business, the weakness is that they are not able to train the people to the degree that would be necessary because they don't have time. They don't have time. Does that answer your question? Yeah? Yeah.
Hi, Gabriel. My name is Annie. My question is, what's your tip for longevity in cooking? Because these days I see so many chefs that they be cooking so early. You know, in the old days we have to move from common chef, dinner chef, you know, in the hierarchy in the kitchen to be managing a kitchen. But this as soon as the chef qualified after the apprenticeship, straight into managing kitchen.
Yeah.
And not long after they left.
It's a long question, but what's the key to longevity? I was surprised when I arrived in Australia to see that people would do an apprenticeship somewhere, especially in country areas. And then they've spent 3 years and they stay 1 more year, 4 years, and then the chef goes, they become the head chef. And that's a big, big danger. Because suddenly you are so busy running a kitchen, cooking for those people, that you don't have time to be creative and you stagnate and you get burnout and if you are into relationships, it's very difficult. I always tell younger generation, try to work for a number, work with really good people for as long as you can until you are ready, until you become a sous chef somewhere, which is often the person doing most, and then work for yourself, but not too early, not too early. So do your apprenticeship of management, of training, of human development and things like that. To run a busy kitchen, you know, when you are early 20s it can work. Some people can manage, but with difficulties. The way to longevity is to get that balance in your life. You know, the things that really wanted to talk, I think that's, you know, with exercise, with your health, with your doing other things than your work, it's sometimes very difficult, especially if you are a young parent. I've always found in the whole of my life, the most demanding part, apart from the early years where basically we were not slaves, but we really work for very little money. But luckily, I survived, and I used the skills that I learned to make a career that has been lovely, successful and long, and it's not finished. But the health aspect of it is really important. The most difficult part is if you are young parents with children, because this is really important. Your family is important. To share what needs to be done. And if you're a chef and a baker, it's very hard. It's very hard. It's a bit unusual. But that's, so you need to work it out so it can work for you. Yeah. Any more questions?
Perhaps they've got one.
Yeah.
maybe a little bit sort of contentious, not sort of picking up some themes. We were talking about your experiences in London, and it sounds like now it's a little bit more inclusive, a lot more ideas, a lot more people joining the profession. In terms of that, I mean, like you said, a lot more ideas. In terms of the role of the head chef moving on, you know, sort of into the future, do you think that's going to change somewhat? You know, how they run the kitchen, you talked about that military organisation.
Yeah.
But considering now the environment is a lot more inclusive with ideas coming in now, do you think that role of head chef will change?
Yeah, well, there's been a big evolution in the role of the head chef. When I did my apprenticeship, the owner that had been there for 3 generations was in the kitchen every day, cooking. At the time he was 57, it was very lucky. I always considered it was lucky to have a head chef of 57 whose father had worked with, you know, people that had worked with Escoffier and things like that. So the people were in their kitchen. So now there's still head chefs like that, like Philippe Mouchel, my friend, is still in his restaurant. Sometimes I go and see him at 11 o'clock. He's chopping the shallots, and at lunchtime he's helping in the kitchen. He's at the pass. And then in big establishment, of course, the head chefs are purely organizers doing the ordering. They don't cook anymore. They rely on their sous chef. And then there is the head chefs, like a number of them we know now in Australia, that have got 3 or 4 restaurants. And they run those 3 or 4 restaurants from their office. They might work on some menu with second chefs and things like that. But it is true, like when I see Philippe, my friend, that is such a good chef, but suffering enormously with health issues. It's true that, I can tell you I'm 68, I could not see myself in a kitchen at the stove at my age. You know, it's retirement age, okay? I'm in bracket. But there's a moment where at 68, you can be as creative and, you know, you can be a wonderful manager and, you know, you have got your head on your shoulder, and if you're healthy, everything goes well. But physically, it would be stupid, I think, to still be cooking at the stove for many hours a day because you are going to affect your health. So at some stage, the chef needs to really be a good manager and have people around him or her to do that hard work. There's no doubt that I always felt that, you know, the most productive chef, you know, that the chef, you need to work fast. As a chef, speed is really a big thing. Between the professional and the non-professional, you see how you know, you need to work fast. So that's really between the age of 25 and, you know, and 55, ideally. Okay, I think we have done the bit.
Thank you so very much, Gabrielle, for an incredible journey on mentorship with such engaging anecdotes from your own career and its considerable breadth. If you'll join me in thanking Gabrielle. I think. It is a great pleasure to welcome the panel to the stage, but I'll introduce Emily and then allow her to introduce everybody who's on the stage. You will, of course, be aware of the fabulous work of Emily Salkeld, formerly of South Australia, but South Australia's loss is Victoria's gain, absolutely. It's absolutely fabulous to welcome you to the stage, Emily. Please come on over. Thanks, Kate.
Okay, we've assembled the array of extremely diverse millers up here. I'm going to go through and ask them, each of them, what their mill is and how it actually processes the grain into flour. But first, I'll introduce Ian, who's right here, Ian Congdon. He and Courtney Young have a property, 100 acres, up at Rutherglen, and they're closely connected to Ian's folks who are just over the border at Berrigan. They produce their own grain, a few different types of grain, including wheat and rye. Have you still got Corazan going?
Just a little bit.
Just a little bit, yeah. We usually don't talk about Corazan when we're talking millers because it's just damn hard to grow, damn hard to get. Anyway, Ian and Courtney own and run a new American stone mill, and they've really built their business around fresh flour that's based on a whole grain product, and they've recently been recipients of Sustainable Table funding to diversify their business into a sifted flour product as well. And then just next to Ian is Thomas Moritz, and Thomas and Gabby from up at Cheshunt, north of us in the high country. They've got a mixed farm. I know they've got dairy goats, and they produce beautiful whole grain products from their stone milled flour for markets and for the local community. We're really lucky to have people coming down from the country to be sharing sort of the real history of how they started milling and why they started milling. Particularly, we're lucky that Thomas and Gabby decided that to keep Gabby in the country so that she would continue to eat beautiful food. They got the mill in the first place because she was about to leave and go back home to, to Europe because there was no damn good bread around in the local area. Adam Rivet is the next miller along, and he and his wife Florence are up at Millawa. They've got Millawa Bread and Millawa Kitchen. They've got a stone mill as well, and Adam has an extremely diverse set of skills, which I guess everybody on this panel does. But he's been working in kitchens and wineries. He trained as an electrical engineer. Did you specialise in electrical engineering? Mechanical engineering, yeah, just so that he could be a technician in the kitchen and fix things, which is pretty much what he does every week, I know that. He also mills and bakes. And then James Fisher is another stalwart of the GrAiNZ community. He's got a mill at... James is... he's a roving miller baker, and his mill is always kind of connected to him. I don't know where it is. I sort of kind of always imagine your mill is just behind you in a shadow form because you... I don't know where it is physically located, but I know you're always nearby. And I see your flour all around the place around Victoria. Always a great voice, always got lots of ideas, very creative solutions to all kinds of challenges and problems that local food practitioners face. So very valuable. And then Robert Pekin, the next man along here, he has come down from Brisbane, and he's been a stalwart of food hub building up in Brisbane through Food Connect Brisbane, but also the Shed, which is now called, I think it's the Salisbury Shed and Mill, I think. It's Salisbury Mill, yeah. Yep, so that's another close connection with Sustainable Table. They're really partnering together to leverage funding towards creating a very comprehensive food hub up there. And that mill, well, you can talk about it, but yeah, it's another stone mill that has come via Ian and his brother Hamish back down in the Rutherglen, Berrigan area. And next to Robert is Jason. Jason's an old friend of mine, and been lucky enough to work for Jason and Emma in the last 3 months at Geelong Farm. And really, these guys have been farming and growing various things, including grapes, but more recently, since 2016, a really diverse array of cereal grains. right up the top of the Mornington Peninsula in a region that's not really known for wheat growing. So they've taken the challenge up and to kind of put in place some ideas about diversity and about layering various enterprises on their farm, including grazing, cover cropping. There's some beautiful black cattle on that property. They've got beef production going, but also most recently, following the milling operation over the last few years, they've added a bakery, and that's also deepened their connections to their local community and their customers on the Mornington Peninsula. So I'm going to ask you all to pass the microphone along and just give us a bit of an outline of how you approach your milling and what your mill is firstly, how it actually works, whether it's a single pass, whether there's a circulation that occurs, and what you like about your final product. Thanks, Ian.
So our mills, we run both a New American stone mill as well as a very similar style mill that me and my brother Hamish built, which runs, they both got natural granite stones. It's very simple milling, I guess you could say. It's just grain in, single pass, and we aim for a very fine whole grain flour that comes out. We're not tempering the grain, so we're grinding the bran quite small. And we run that probably 5-6 days a week and do, about 2 tonne a week at the moment. And then with the addition of the sifter, we're looking to mainly with retail flour, just provide a high extraction. So just sifting down what we currently are producing to produce something that's just, it still carries a fair bit of the nutrition and a lot of the flavour of the stone ground whole grain, but just is a little bit easier to work with so that people aren't wanting to blend with other flours as much. They can get everything from us locally, basically.
Oh yeah, that works. Okay. Yeah.
Good start.
Oh, you've got the same. You've got it now in your face. Okay. Yes. Thanks, Emily, for telling that we've been still here because we're milling grain. Okay. As we said, we came 35 years ago. We brought a little mill with us, and Gabby was going to go back home, because we couldn't eat the bread here. That was basically it. So I got thrown into the deep end. Gabby was the main chef, cook, whatever you want to call it. And from there on, we bought Sourdough Getreidemühlen, which means it's one of the original mills back in Europe. They've been building those mills for about 80 years. Okay. So they're built in Austria. And there's a few offsprings of those ones, okay? So you get the Waldner, you get the Skippy grain mills, all those ones, they're basically offsprings of the Osttiroler. Ours is a stone mill, it's a 500 mil stone mill, and we try to produce only whole grain flour. And whole grain flour with the most nutrition left in it, which means, we mill reasonably slow, but also reasonably cold. So everything, all the grains which come through, the whole lot goes through, and nothing comes out more than 30 degrees, okay? So we try to maintain all the vitamins in the grain when we mill it. And also, the flour we mill, it most probably gets used the next 12 hours, which makes it really, really fickle in using and baking bread. So we are one of the very few, I suppose. We don't use white flour. I can't bake with white flour. I'm sorry. So if you ask questions about white flour, ask all the other guys, not me. And it's just a tricky situation, with freshly grained whole grain milling. And the thing is, my aim is basically to produce the most nutritious flour and bread, which we sell at markets and in the cafe. We've got a cafe, so that's where it all goes in. All the products are whole grain. Pastries, bread, the whole lot. All right?
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Thomas. We're actually based not far from Thomas and Ian, so we're actually pretty lucky to be in a very small area with such a large amount of stone mills. We mill a similar amount to Ian and Courtney each week. We've got the capacity to mill more, but we've actually cut back due to my exuberance, I suppose. We have several mills. My wife imports, or did, French mills. We have a range of sizes. We've got a 30 centimetre stone, we've got a 50 centimetre stone, a 70 and a metre. We also have the mock mill and then lots of different small mills of varying sizes. So we've got a collection. And to be honest, most of them are used every week, depending on what we're milling. We mill a diverse range of grains. We mill corn, we mill millet, we mill rye, we mill wheat, buckwheat, and that's our philosophy within the bakery, is to mill a diverse range of grains. So, yeah.
So I don't know. I've got an Osti roller mill. It's a Osti 500. So it's got a half-metre stone on it. It's a composite stone, so it's not granite. It has a sifter, so I bolt the flour as well as producing whole flour. I spent quite a long time baking using my own flour, and I think that gave me some sort of depth of insight into understanding the process of milling and how the nuance of the milling process engages or interacts with the nuances of the sourdough baking process. But I don't bake anymore. I just produce flour and sell it to the bakers of Melbourne, which has allowed me to be producing more flour, which ultimately is, I think, the game that I'm in, is, you know, getting more of the land coverage of Victoria into being biodynamic or organic soil system through the sale of organic biodynamic flour. Most of my flour, almost all my flour, comes from these wonderful people over here. Say hello.
Do you mean their grain?
Their grain, yeah. Sorry, yeah. I think that does that say everything? Thanks. I think so.
It doesn't say everything. We sat around the fire on the first night and you told me all sorts of things about your operation. So, yeah, we've got a Woodstock stone mill built by Ian and Hamish. It's a 1 metre, I think. I haven't really measured the rock, but it's 400 kilos of rock on top of another 400 kilos of granite from just up the road here at, what's the name of the... Harcourt, yeah, from a quarry up there. So it's just because we're in Brisbane, I was very cognisant of not having any timber in the mill, so it's just steel and rock. It's a beautiful mill. Hamish and Ian did an amazing job. And I've never milled flour before, so we commissioned it in the middle of COVID. Just rang Ian and Hamish thinking, someone must be making mills in Australia. You know, everyone's making bread in the middle of COVID. You know, surely there's a demand for someone to build mills. And Ian said, no one. There's no one I know of. And then said, but Ian and Hamish, him and his brother are thinking of building one. And I said, well, you're building two. So, so that was an amazing process involving the whole community at Berrigan and engineers and all sorts of, and trying to find, granite that would do the job. It's a beautiful mill. Uncle Cal is he's my fellow miller, and Emily, who's just sitting here, she's come on as the #1 miller now. So she's milling flour. We've been trialling milling with all sorts of grains over the last year and a half. We've just finished building the mill room to make it all certified and food safe and all that sort of stuff inside of the hub. And the reason we built it, well, the reason why I commissioned it was because I've been in fresh food and dairy farming all of my life, and it wasn't until COVID that suddenly I realised that the product we eat is in all of our diets was just no one knew what fresh flour was in Brisbane. Like, there's no fresh flour in Brisbane unless you order it through Gunnedah. So it was like a real penny dropping for me that this ubiquitous substance called flour, in, I don't know, 60% of our diet is flour. And I thought, wow, how can that be possible? So, so we're We're working with a lot of Indigenous groups. We've tried milling and aspirating gamalay or Mitchell grass. The other day we made damper with, we've got a couple of Indigenous, we've got lots of we've got 32 tenants in the shed who all want to play around with the flowers. We've got one Indigenous chef called Chris Jordan from Three Little Birds, and he got us milling cupperbunda and swordgrass. Swordgrass, not speargrass, I'm trying to remember. Yeah, so we're really excited working with Indigenous people because we are in the lands of the oldest millers and bakers in the world, and we need to really acknowledge that, and in particular the women who were probably the main millers at the time. So we want to sort of bring back that economy and bring back that connection to native grains and perennial native, bring back that because our Indigenous kids need to go out into the country and to rediscover those amazing millets and rices and grains. So that's our goal with the Salisbury Mill. It's a traineeship for Indigenous kids to find a way back to country and get their minds and their hands busy, and your hearts. Milling is as we all know, it's an amazing process. It's very visceral. We're still figuring it out. We've only been milling for a year, but it's such a beautiful thing to do.
Hi everyone. We operate two mills. One of them's a double stone mill, so like two turntables. The rocks are turn very slowly at 24 RPM. We produce all kinds of flour from that mill. There's a sifter attached, so we can do high extraction flour, whole grain flour, what have you. It's connected to a grain transport system that's pneumatic, so both the grain and the flour are maintained at an ambient temperature the whole time through the mill. The sifter, you can change the mesh, so we usually run an 80 mesh sifter, which is about 200 micron, and to produce an 85% extracted flour, we do about 100 kilos an hour. We can do it a bit quicker, but the flour, I feel, is not as good. We also run a roller mill. Roller mills are much maligned because they're an association with industrial food system, but our experience has been that you can produce any kind of flour from a roller mill that you can produce in a stone mill, and some other flours as well. So our roller mill, same kind of system in terms of integrated sifting and transport, so it's cool the whole time. And yeah, with both the versatile systems, they're mills that I bought because of originally price, and I had room in a container coming from China, but we've found them to be really suitable for what we do and function very well. And of course there's a very long history of milling in China, so they know what they're doing.
Thanks, Jace. Can you hold on to the microphone? I just want everybody after this to run back down the line. Just maybe comment about the grain quality, that your thoughts on grain quality, and also connections back to the farmer, whether that can be improved, whether there are some thoughts you have on quality and seasonal variation that really need to be communicated back down to the end user, the recipients of your flour. You are a farmer, of course, Jason, but I know you do grow grains with other farmers, so yeah.
So the grain is different every year, even the same variety. So you have to respond to that in your milling, and of course the baker in the baking. In terms of grain quality, it's great to get beautiful, well-developed grain that hits a certain protein point, or actually potentiates the grain potential. So whether it's a hard red or hard white wheat, it hits those protein marks that people enjoy, and also a falling number, so that it's actually got the goods when you want to bake with it. The other aspects are moisture content, and moisture content sometimes it's under 12%. If you want your grain under 13% for storage, but it actually mills better at a bit higher percentage. We don't temper our grain, but geez, I wish we did sometimes. So some hard reds and hard whites are pretty hard going through the mill, and some softer grains just, you know, explode into instant flour, and it's beautiful to mill, like Byron Biodynamic Spelt. It's just, it's a dream to mill, that stuff. And what else can I tell you about milling and coming straight from the farm? The other thing is cleaning. So sometimes it doesn't come off the paddock perfectly clean. So we've got some cleaning equipment, but we're restricted to the cleaning equipment we have. If I get grain professionally milled and all the screenings are taken out, everything's uniform size, and then run it through the mill, it's easier, of course. But because of our system of having a sifter attached to the mill, you can adjust it so that you can still achieve the flour you want, but you take off that chaff and gloom and, you know, bits of crap that are in there that you know, limit flour quality.
And how do you go communicating some of those variations to your flour customers?
So most of the grain I have analysed and I can tell them what it's like, but I mean, we now have a bakery, but we also have relationships with our bakery customers, so I can see Hannah's here, and so I asked them, you know, how's it going, what's this one like, and it's great to get that feedback. But yeah, the general acceptance of, I guess, lack of uniformity from year to year, and also throughout the year, things change in the silo, even at the same grain. Bakers still would like that Caputo-like consistency, but it's not what I can provide. We definitely aim for it, but there's always some variation. And even day to day, you know, if it's two different people operating the mill, there's actually different results. So,
Thanks.
Yeah, we don't temper our grain, so it's because we're in Brisbane, it's very humid. So we found, except for rice, when we ground rice, it was so hard. It really took us a couple of days to figure out how to get that to a consistency that in the kitchen we've got a couple of Asian chefs who really fascinated by the whole process of using rice flour. It's a very high-end use, so normally you don't use rice flour. Rice flour is not it's a very specialty. It's only used at weddings and things like that. But the grains, we've used all Ian's grains, his Rosella and his Spitfire, and we've put a couple of bags of Baxter through the other day, which was really soft. Like same thing, it just exploded into flour. I was like, wow, this is like a dream. But we're still learning. Obviously, our role is to sort of relay what the farmers we've got 3 bakers who have been trialling, a Russian baker, a German baker and a French baker. The Russian baker just wants it straight as soon as it comes out of the mill. She just loves that volatility and that, you know, where the enzymes and the life is just exploding. She plays around with that. The French baker wants it 4 days after it's been milled, exactly, like he calls that the maturing of the flour. And the German baker, he doesn't want it for 10 days. He wants it like dead almost. Because he's such a purist and he just wants he wants the consistency, but it's like weird. And then, of course, we've got all sorts of other people in the kitchen who are just going to make cookies and banana breads and just all sorts of things and play around with us. So we're not going to get too, if a baker wants something too consistent, we're going to say, listen, probably not for us. Or you can try blending it maybe 10% and use your normal flour, and then maybe over time they might get a liking for the flavour and the texture and whatever comes out of the products that they're making. But our main role is to communicate that the seasons are going to be varying, the grains are going to be variable, and we just want them to have that experience and go with that journey with us as millers. It's never going to be perfect, and for the future we're looking at in terms of a whole food system approach. We need bakers and chefs and cooks all going with the flow a lot more than having this consistent product. We don't sift. We don't want to sift, but there's plenty of sifted flour out there they can buy.
I don't think it's really that much of a big deal. I think that any baker who's got his chops on deals and responds with the subtle variations that there are. And to me, day to day, week to week, the variance in the quality of the flour is subtle. It's subtle, and really it's down to eyeballing it when you put the bassinage in, and like dealing with it in the bowl. I haven't really seen any sort of results when I've been baking with my flour that are difficult to deal with at all. And the people who are buying flour from me, and I think I'd probably speak for anybody on this panel, they're people who really care about the quality of their product and the flavour and the nutrition, and they've probably been in the game for a while and they've got their chops, So I don't think there's any issue there, and certainly nothing that isn't just resolved day to day in good communication. I think probably like we're all on the similar sort of level here, where I make the flour, I deliver it to the bakers, and I talk to them, and I talk to my farmers, and we all know one another, and we all talk with one another all of the time. So if there's something that needs, I don't think do you remember a time where I've sort of come back to you and gone, hey, I need to talk to you about your grain? It's pretty, in my experience, it's pretty consistent. It's certainly well within the bounds that the bakers can deal with, and that might also be that, I've got a kind of suck it up attitude, it's flour, deal with it, it's not hard. So that's.
You're getting your grain direct from some farmers and through a middle dealer, some of your grain, or is it mostly?
No, it's well. Look, my grain comes from Stephen Tanya.
Yeah.
It does bounce through the biodynamic marketing company along the way, but this is really just for the conveniences of logistics, right? Yeah. It's easier for the freight company to dump the grain in Lilydale, which is close to me, and then I can.
The grain that comes direct from Bellarine is very well cleaned.
That's right. It's super
really
clean.
So but that can be an issue if you are dealing with other farmers, if they don't have on-farm infrastructure that enables them to. Really, they're used to delivering straight off the header, pretty much into a bulk silo, and not dealing with smaller mills. It'll be a different story, and you may need to put that infrastructure in place at your mill site, which can be an added.
I think I'm blessed, right? So maybe that's giving me a siloed perspective.
But that's a good relationship right there. Yeah. Thanks, James.
Thanks, James. Look, I'm a little bit with James, where we, over the past, have got grain off Ian and Courtney and Burrum. Thank you. Grain's beautiful. We also grew grain for a couple of years, so that's been our stock, but we're out of that now. We don't have an issue with quality of grain at the moment, but going forward, I think if there's more and more growers, then there's that potential to be able to have those communications with farmers, and I'm not sure how I have that. It's not a skill level that I've got to be talking to the farmers about.
I think it works both ways. Everybody learns, and you just.
And I think that's a new stage and a new step once that happens. But at the moment, grain quality is beautiful. And look, I'm with James. We sell a very little amount of retail flour at the shop, but our focus, our customers are my bakers. We mill for ourselves. So I'm a bit like James. I've baked for 20 years. If my bakers can't deal with it, suck it up.
Yeah.
I can do it, so can you.
Right.
But that's our focus, is to mill flour each week, to mill nutritious, highly dense flour, and put back into our product.
You're also buying some flour?
Yeah, look, we are, and a lot. But our focus, over the next few years is to, in stages, cut that out. And look, we've had 3 very clear steps. The first one was as we're a very big operation, we've cut that back by half. Initially benchtop mills were for milling whole grain flour for feeds. That was step 1. You know, it's a small step and we ticked that off. Next stage was that all of the whole grain flour that was in the building was milled by us. We've ticked that one off as well. The next stage was high extraction flour, and we're pretty close to ticking that one off. And then that sort of finer white flour that we're using, it's an interesting one at the moment because there's a training within the bakery for the bakers. We're moving away from that to the high extraction flour, but there's a real training for both the customer base and also our bakers. So that's where we're at the moment.
Thanks, Adam. We were always in the lucky position not to be in the position like Adam is, because we never made white fluffy bread. So we always made whole grain bread. So we are also in a slightly different position like everybody else here, because we've been buying grains from a lot of suppliers over the last 35 years from Australia. We started off with, I'm not sure if people remember, organic technology, you know, from Wagga Wagga. There was Alan Drews, you know, all the grain now they produce that goes into licorice, okay, organic licorice. But we used to buy grain from them. We used to buy rye grain from Ian's dad. Ian wasn't even on the planet then, I think. I'm not sure, I think it was your sisters actually. we're talking about early 90s, you know, mid 90s. So, and then we had a very, very good relationship, you know, we were basically test bakers, you know, for Andrew Fawcett, you know, Powlett Hill. You know, we're talking 16, 17, 18 years ago when they started milling. So they've got a stone mill. And when Andrew pulled this, you know, the new crop off, you know, we got a few bags, you know, tested it and baked, and you know, it was sort of a really good relationship with Powlett Hill. We also had a, you know, baking relationship with Murphac. I'm not sure if people remember Murphac, you know, from Benalla. They've got 6 stone mills, you know, so a lot of people don't know them at all. So our biggest change basically came when we hit a reasonable snag back in most probably 2007, 2008. We got some grain from Powlett Hill and we milled it and the bread was crap, absolutely dead. You know, we couldn't believe it, you know. We went back to Andrew and this and we just could not work out, you know, what was going on. In the end, you know, we did a lot of research and we found a company which was called Mühlenchemie in Germany. And it's quite amazing. I brought a little, you can take a photo of this, but this company, they pride themselves of treating 15% of the world's consumption of flour, which makes it 50 million tons, all right? And they've got about 500 different additives to standardize flour. And unfortunately, a lot of those additives then don't have to declare because they're all a lot of enzymes. And enzymes are not considered to be a chemical. So they don't have to put them on the list. So I've got the book down there, if some people, it's the most expensive book I ever bloody bought, you know. It cost me $300 or $350, a tiny little book, you know. You can have a look at it. It's in English. So, yeah. But those really brought it back to us, you know, what's been done with our flour. And we did find out. They were very helpful. They thought they found a new customer, you know, so we were only extracting information from them. So they basically hinted at us, you know, what was happening. And if you look at that list, you know, how you can treat, you know, bug damaged, starch damaged, you know, heat damaged, waterlogged, and you go through the whole process of the production, milling and whatever. You can do anything with any grain, you know, and you have a consistent product at the end of the day. So hence, the flour, you know, or grain from Barham Dynamics, you know, is exactly the same as the grain which comes out of WA, you know. The product is the same and Sunnycrust is happy again, okay? So, and I think that was our biggest change, and we thought, well, we need to change this. We need to go to really, really whole grain and educate people about the dangers of sifted and milled commercial flour. I'm not talking about Ian's, you know, he doesn't fiddle with enzymes, not yet, and he never will be, okay? So, and I think, you know, that's a very, very important factor, you know. So we have been through all the grain, I wouldn't say all the grain manufacturers, but at the moment we buy grain, you know, at the rye grain comes from Murray Dynamics or from Ian's dad. The wheat comes from either Pete Hurcott or from Ian or Barry Edwards, you know, which is is a biodynamic grower. Paulette Hill supplies some spelt sometimes, and it depends, you know, how their crops are going. Or the spelt we get from, I forget his name, from near Horsham. There's a grower down there. So we stick to 100% Victorian, or in Ian's case, Berrigan way grain. You know, we don't go any further. We've had whole grain milled as well a long time ago, but we just stick locally, you know. And I think that's what we need to do. And I think for people like, there's not many other bakers, millers on the panel, but if you are, it's a challenge, you know. Freshly milled whole grain flour, you know, is a challenge, you know. As you said, you know, suck it up or leave it or something, you know. It's a good saying, but it's difficult. All right, thanks. Ian.
I think in terms of consistency, because of our scale, we're using the same parcel of grain for a whole year or even 2 years, as we are still now. We're still in 2021 harvest Spitfire wheat. And so actually we've had a lot of feedback saying that this stuff is more consistent than what a lot of people can get, because it's not blended and changed. So it's a single origin, single parcel of grain that we store for however long we need to. But I think what the really important thing is, and why Steve and Tan are such great suppliers of grain, is because of their storage protocols. And that's a really hard thing for, like, if we're sort of asking other farmers to expand this sort of industry, which is what we're basing it on, you need to get that good, clean grain. And that's really, really difficult. And the storage is really difficult. And so you see a lot of people who will sell a couple of bags to someone and it'll be great, but then aren't able to keep that consistency because either they get sick of doing little bags and so I think we just need to remember that is a really big sticking point for milling and access to grains. So, but it's also really important. So I think it's one of those things. I think there's a few projects happening at the moment where we can collectivise, and there's definite things that can happen. But before we can see that expand, I think, yeah, there's a bit of work to be done.
Thanks, Ian. Now, I'm going to get a bit dry. We're going to talk about training in the milling industry. We can maybe get to that, but I really want to ask a hard question now. Everybody's buying and growing their own grain on this panel. I'm wondering how flexible they are with regards to nutrition. This does relate to human nutrition and also soil health. But how flexible are you about the way those grains are grown? Looking forward, there's various stages of transition in agriculture that people are aiming to respond to the virtuous processor aim. There are customers who are wanting to buy food products from a virtuous producer or a virtuous processor. Okay, you're small scale, you're localising your grain economy, but it's not always possible to get the highest, lowest input grain that you can. I know we've had a good few years, but I also know that back in 2018, 2019, in our context over in South Australia, we could not get rye grain. And our wheat grain was incredibly drought affected, and suck it and see, wait until you get back there. You know, it's really, really hard to use that kind of grain. So how flexible are you? How forgiving are you of transition stages in farming to try to reach something that where everybody's sort of getting a much higher quality?
There you go. I mean, for us, the reason we mill is because we want to be farming a certain way, and that way is organic, low input system, integrating animals and keeping people on the land and revitalising that country. So I guess we are very strict We've been lucky that we've been able to store enough through the better years to get through the tough years. When we have had to buy grain off mum and dad's farm or our farm, we've gone to our wider network of organic growers and sort of been able to buy it off the header and then take those cleaning and storage parts that are tricky. And going forward, I mean, we've thought about, I mean, James mentioned earlier, like trying to get, like if we see the mill as a lever for helping more people grow a certain way or grow the way they want to and then be rewarded for it financially, our mill would need to be much, much bigger. And so, like the scale that we're milling at is like, it's only sort of 50 to 100 acres of grain in a good year, which is very small, really. Yeah, so, yeah, if we were to get bigger, then there's different ideas about certifications and transitions and stuff like that. And I know there's, you know, the whole grain milling certified sustainable is sort of, I guess that's that idea that they couldn't get enough organic grain and so have had to bring in a new standard which is better than the alternative. And yeah, so it's quite interesting, but I'll let everyone else speak.
Thanks. For us, the cleaning has, you know, as a user of grain has actually never been a big problem, because we found most farmers, you know, we bought the grain from, they've had good enough cleaning equipment, you know, and they're more than proud of, you know, to do a good job, you know. So all the farmers really we've been dealing with, you know, including Ian, you know, and whatever, you know, they've done a good job in cleaning. So the cleaning is not an issue. Storing, different ball game. And that's where, you know, started before, you know, when we had this problem with our grain 15 years ago. And we went back to Andrew, you know, I didn't quite finish then. And what happened was they had a big crop and they had a lot of grain and it was stored in the silos. The grain was harvested in summer, it went through the first winter, went into the next springtime, okay, went into the next, through summer, autumn, and that's when it started to become difficult, because all of a sudden, through 1.5 cycles, that grain thought, for me, well, it's really time to start sprouting, you know, because it was in the silo. It went through all the temperature changes, like a normal grain would go when you plant it. So the storage is an issue, and then what happened was there was starch damage. Serious starch damage was done in that grain, you know, and it didn't, you know, when you baked it, it didn't gelatinise anymore, you know. When you had this sort of layer down the bottom, you think it's been undercooked and it's been this, and it just didn't set properly anymore, okay. So I think the storage is an issue, and we've got to be careful that, you know, that we don't store the grain, you know, going through all those temperature cycles, you know, for any length of time. You know, that could be an issue for some farmers. Training, for us the training is easy because it's on the job. So we mill it, we use it, I see the effects straight away, okay? If there is a vitamin or a quality issue because the grain, I don't know that. But we try to minimise our effects on the processing, you know, to damage any more. Okay, so we try to, like the vitamin B, vitamin B1, B6, you know, they're very, very heat sensitive. Vitamin C is heat sensitive. Folates are heat sensitive. Vitamin B group, you can actually increase the temperature, you know, sensitivity, you know, if it runs through an acidic, including sourdough, process. So once it goes in and it's in the dough, you can bring it up the temperature up to 100 degrees before baking, and it usually doesn't get to that internally. So, but therefore you have to make sure the vitamins are still in there before you start making the dough. So that means the milling process needs to be on a low temperature. So I think the working together between us, the millers, the bakers, and the growers, you know, is really, really crucial, and we need that feedback, you know, from anybody. You know, the grower needs to ask continuously, you know, find out Okay, how's your grain going? How's it going with the baking? And, you know, we need that feedback, you know. And most bakers, unfortunately, they're under real time pressure, money pressure, you know. They haven't got the time to play around with it, you know. But we need to get back to that. We need that feedback, and then we can make sure the customer gets a top product, you know. And it's a top product for your body, not for your eyes, okay? That's what we need.
Thanks, Thomas.
You've already kind of touched on it, haven't you? But yeah, with your relationship with farmers. But yeah, if you have anything more to add, that would be.
So, but training as well?
More really, I'm looking at where you get your grain from year on year in times of scarcity.
Yeah.
How far are you willing to go? Maybe back into the conventional grain supply, and how far, what sort of long-term thinking do you have around grain?
Well, I'd like to say no, but we haven't been challenged to that stage yet because we've been very lucky. I suppose actually no. So we've been using polenta for 20 years, and there's supposedly a polenta shortage in the country. Luckily, Ian put us onto a contact a few weeks ago, and we sourced organic gristine corn in New South Wales. So that's been absolutely fantastic and started a new journey within the bakery that we wanted to start, and we've been trialling over the last couple of years. But speaking to the farmer is an interesting one because I think it's very relative to this question, is that he's in his 70s, he's getting rid of the farm. So, you know, we're losing somebody from the farming fraternity, and not just the farming fraternity, but from organic growing fraternity. With access.
He's been flexible with the quantities that he's supplied you. Maybe the next generation will just be more wanting to put it on a shipping container. And
absolutely.
Export it.
I mean, look, we drove up there and picked up a couple of tonne, but I mean, he was great. Like, he goes, "Oh, I'll drive 3 tonne down for you." I mean, most of the people we'd speak to would be, you know, a truck. Yeah, and we're not set up to do that. That's one of our challenges for the size of our milling operation, is we haven't got the infrastructure. That's our biggest challenge. Our infrastructure doesn't match our milling capacity. So,
let alone storage, I guess. Yeah.
It isn't a problem that I've had to face. Maybe I'm just optimistic for hopefully I won't ever have to. But I think, in line with what I said earlier about keeping communication really broad and open with both suppliers and customers, I think if organic and biodynamic grain were completely unavailable because something really terrible happened, I would go to my customers and say, "What do you want to do about this? You know, I can't supply you with organic and biodynamic flour. Do you want me to mill some conventional flour for you?" I'd look to what I could source and have find the most virtuous solution that I could to that problem when it arose. I think just that. But I guess I'm providing a service to my customers, so I'd be talking to them about that problem.
Because we run a food hub, we've got a pretty, and we're not about certification per se, we're really interested in the character of the farm and where the farmer is going in terms of their journey to more diversified growing and becoming more resilient. Because it's grain, it's a dry product, so the ecological impact is, you can go a lot further afield than a lettuce or something that you should be growing in your backyard. So for us, it's not a really big issue. We're really, and this is like Sustainable Table, we're really interested in how the infrastructure and the logistics will operate up and down the eastern seaboard, including South Australia, in terms of providing that resilience. Our main focus, though, is on training Indigenous kids. So it'd be great to have 10 mills in Brisbane all grinding flour to provide that experience and flavour and nutritional profile that people can experience and get close to and really discover and then become connected to this whole other world of just eating something that's whole and fresh. So that's our main role is to stimulate that economy. We don't see going to be too many problems with accessing, grain growers. There's plenty of grain. I think the 60 million we feed is meat, grain, and what's the other thing that we grow in excess? Sugar. So it's a bit of a furphy. I mean, from a resilience point of view, there's a lot of other things: seafood, fruit and veg, milk. Now we import milk. So there's a lot of other challenges on the food systems point of view. But I think flour, because it is so ubiquitous in our diet, it's sort of like the anchor staple that we can use to communicate a much bigger story about our food system and how, not to say how, we're the agricultural journey we've been on, particularly over the last 40 or 50 years, is at a point now where we know that road we have to take a fork in the road, and so it's for all of us to sort of help society go down many other forks in the road and discover something new for themselves.
In terms of storage, I think that was an important point I actually didn't think of in terms of a nutritional context, but our storage is in sealed silos with a system similar to Ian and probably Burren, I'm not sure, which is temperature and humidity control by electronic means. And when I fill a silo, we blow in some diatomaceous earth that if insects get in there, it desiccates the carapace of the insect before they breed. It seems to work well.
Can you just quickly describe what the conventional
Meldocin or something like that, as it's going into the silo. Mind you, conventional growers will use the techniques that I use as well, but they pour Meldocin or as it goes into the silo, or they also fumigate it with a phosphine gas or something like that, which works really well, of course. Yeah. So in terms of training, I haven't done any formal training in milling. It's been just picking it up as I went along. And so when we've had other people milling at Geelong, I show them the basics and then they work it out. And I found that everyone has their own style and there ends up being a fairly consistent product, but there's definitely people will pull it up a bit quicker than, say, I do, because they're worried about... So in terms of farming technique, and so we grow in a low input system, so we don't use the same amount of ag chem that conventional growers do. So if you look at whole grain milling's sustainability standard, we use a lot less that's in that standard. In terms of bulking up grain of specialist varieties, we use every tool in the box. I'm more interested in getting enough seed of different things. There's probably some ideological opposition to that, but I'm focused on diversity in grain and just getting it out there. In terms of our milling wheats, we are quite happy with how we grow, and it suits our land and our scale, most importantly. And I'd actually like to do some testing of everyone's grain in terms of quality of nutritional value and things like that, and year on year. I'm not sure if you guys have been doing that, because I mean, you've got an amazing farming system, and it'd be great to I guess to prove what you guys already know.
Are you referring to lab testing, Jace? Is that
something? Lab testing of plants and grain and soil, but year on year data. And I really think in 20 years that a lot of these things that we have a feeling about now they'll have scienced the hell out of all of it, so we'll know a lot more.
What would the minimum tests be, like useful ones, do you think?
I think, for soil function, things like carbon and the hydrological cycle, things like that, water penetration, I know you guys have done some work there. And in terms of grain quality, Well, I mean, there's always the protein level. We talk about nutrition in grain, and we're often always talking about the bran and the bran layer. We don't often talk about the ability of the body to absorb the nutrition that's available, and that sometimes comes down to the genetics of the grain. And yeah, we don't often talk about, well, I guess in this context we do, with sourdough enabling the absorption of things that typically aren't absorbable. So I think, yeah, from a nutritional point of view, there's probably a genetic basis and a farming technique basis to that. There's certainly plenty of, I guess what you'd say, certified grain that's not nutritious. Yeah.
Is anybody on the panel doing any testing of their grain prior to milling? Anybody using that?
We were using the bricks meter for all of our veggies to give, like Steve was talking about yesterday, but we haven't done that on the grain yet. We've got a bricks meter and we'd like to use that a bit more, particularly after what Steve said yesterday.
Okay, anybody?
Just moisture.
Moisture levels, yep. And moisture levels, they help you with safe storage, so the grain doesn't start sprouting. But at the other end, if it's overly dry, have you ever found that, Adam?
Yeah. So we use it for how long it. So moisture level for we use for milling, how long we mill for. We find with really hard wheat, it's a challenge to mill. I've had the opportunity to mill in Europe a little bit. Our grain seems to be a lot harder, and on our stone mills, really hard grain is a nightmare. If I know that before we mill, I mill slightly differently. Yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting point that Adam's making, because in the conventional grain trading system, the highest classification is for hard wheat, particularly for global trading, and that's the milling systems are industrial in that case, and none of these mills here are industrial size. So I guess you could say that each of these mills on this panel are more sensitive to grain hardness or softness, and you can amend the grain hardness if it's come from a district that has a hard finish and produces a hard grain, and the genetics of that grain produce that really tough Bellarine bran layer and the really glassy proteins. Then you can temper. But I guess that's another step when you're a small-scale producer. Yeah, Thomas.
Yeah. I usually don't bother about the hardness. All what it does on the stone mill is basically it just grinds the husk finer. Okay, it does. You've got to be a little bit slower, or you can temper it. We did try tempering in some years and thought, no, this. The bran just comes off in bigger flakes, and I mean, we still use it as a whole grain. But yeah, it makes it easier to mill, but. We still use the whole grain.
All right, sorry, Ian, we're going to wrap it up. Thank you very much, everybody. These panel sessions always could go for another hour, right? And we haven't even got to questions and answers. Anyway, I'd like everybody to thank these fantastic millers. We're very lucky in this state to have Melbourne University professors, associate professor, PhD students so close by, and we can hear straight from them what kind of work they're doing. There's something for everybody here in the three talents that we're going to hear from. Professor Rudy Appels is an honorary professor in wheat genetics at the Uni of Melbourne. He's been awarded the Farrer Medal in 2022 for his work understanding the structure and function of the wheat genome, William Farrer was one of the first wheat breeders and probably the first wheat breeder in Australia back in the very late 1880s, 90s and into, I think he finished up in 1923 or?
He passed away in 1905.
1905, okay, I've gone way beyond. Rudy's appointment at the uni allows him to work with research colleagues, postdocs and graduate researchers to understand biochemistry of agriculture and food production. His research papers have covered all kinds of subjects like tracking drought response in wheat heads, as well as working in dough systems and looking at water absorption and microbiology. So that's a wonderful array of topics. Anna Whitwer is a PhD candidate at the Melbourne University, working with Associate Professor Kate Howell. They're studying the properties of lesser known yeast in sourdoughs in an attempt to modify the nutritional quality of bread. Anna is leaving for France very soon to spend 4 months with Delphine Sicard at her laboratory in Montpellier. Delphine Sicard was one of the keynotes at the 2019 GrAiNZ Festival. She's a fantastic French resource on sourdough microbiology and biodiversity. So thanks for sharing, Anna. And then our friend Kate Howell, one of the organisers of GrAiNZ and all the panels, she's an associate professor now in the food chemistry lab, or School of Food Chemistry. She leads a laboratory of postdoctorates and graduate researchers to investigate microbiological ecology and chemistry in food production. And she's passionate about understanding fermentation for flavoursome, delicious and nutritious foods.
Okay, let's hop into it. So I'm Rudy Appels, and I've got this honorary position in Kate Howell's group. So we sort of try and work together. I come from a very basic side of things, and then, but I really enjoy working with the more applied areas. And just in case I can catch anyone afterwards, I've been doing some work on the vortex milling with Axel Mills in Bayswater, which has been quite informative. Okay, so what I'd like to share with you is what is happening in the genetics of the crops. Wheat will be what I focus on because that's what I do, but in fact I'll finish up to indicate that it's actually all the crops that we deal with, the chickpea, you name it. We now have an understanding of the genetics and the capacity to trace traits of interest that we've just never had before. And that's only in the last decade, or the last 5 years even, for that to happen. Okay, grain diversity is the real focus at the basic end of things. And I'll explain that as I go. Okay, so Kate asked me to talk about the family tree, so we'll start at the beginning. We have the Middle East is where a lot of many of the crops that we use in our systems originated, and we have the einkorn wheat, emmer wheat, barley, lentils, peas, and of course the chickpeas as well. And it's about I'll go to the next slide. About 10,000, roughly 10,000 years with respect to wheat that we saw. We can find paleontological evidence that the hexaploid wheat was being grown when people have excavated ovens and looked at the residues that was there. So we have, is there a pointer on this? No. So we have the early period, where the diploids, the two diploids, what we call the A genome, what we now know as einkorn wheat, crossing with a B genome species, and they form what we now know as the durum wheats down here. And that crossed in that area in the red, in the field, there was a random cross, and it's actually quite an easy cross to do between the durum wheat and the goat grass, which has become very popular in recent years, as I'll come to in a minute. Then there was a period where it's been taken a while to work out. It wasn't just a straight lineage to our current wheat, which we thresh and get the grain. There was a crossing, intercrossing, and for quite a long time the spelt was quite popular and was grown. It's got obviously not that easy to thresh, and it's been that sort of mixture, but eventually the societies selected for the threshing. It's interesting, about 2,000 years ago, there are reports in the Chinese literature of spring and winter wheats being recognised. Okay, so with part of the family tree in terms of the Australian aspect, we have William Farrer, who was really the starting point for us. His line of federation was released at the turn of the century in 1900s, and with the genomic, the detailed DNA analysis that we can do now, which is really incredible. We can go back through his pedigrees and the material, the pups. He started with purple straw and the Etowah and the improved 5. So he was really, the pioneering part of what he did was to actually communicate with his colleagues at the time by mail and got samples from all over the world, because intuitively he felt that diversity was the answer to really try and increase both resistance and tolerance and drought tolerance in the material that was being grown in New South Wales at the time. So the interesting thing is the greenish dots that I've outlined, we've actually had this interest in a gene that gives you the udon noodle quality, the Japanese udon noodle quality, and we can actually trace that through insignia, and then of course there's all the current ones. We can trace that back to material that Farrer actually introduced. So although he didn't know it, he really set the basis for what has been an incredibly good industry for the West Australians in terms of exporting udon noodles, quality wheat to Japan. So that's been one of his sort of a real legacy that he left us, which has been valuable. But his basic thing was to do wide crosses, and that was to get this increase in diversity in the material that he could select. And federation was the result. That period of Farrer, there was a lot of activity in Europe. Strumpelli was a particularly innovative breeder. He introduced the dwarfing genes, the short stem, quite a few decades before the big program of Borlaug in that area. So Strumpelli introduced a dwarfing gene from the Japanese wheats, and he produced material which was really the basis for a lot of the European winter wheats for quite a long time. And then we come to the 1960s, where we have Norman Borlaug and his really exciting worldwide based effort for crossings and testing based at Simet, Mexico. Both of these achievements, the key was to reduce the stem length and get more of the nutrition and effort of the plant to go into the grain. And Simet, the program that was and is still based in Mexico, is still really active. So in the 40s and basically up to the current date, the Simet program, I'm just picking a few highlights for you here to share with you. The Simet program really introduced a lot of what we call synthetic wheats. So I was involved in that back in that time, and they produced the big collections that have been collected by a collector from Japan who'd gone to the Middle East and collected all the D genome, the goat grass, you know, that spindly little wheat head. But in fact, and that's in fact the least of the variables in the current wheats. And what they've done is to then say, okay, well, let's just cross the accessions of the cultivars, the D genomes into the hexaploids and reproduce what nature did at the turn of, in the 10,000 years ago. And that's been a huge program. 1,500 synthetic wheats now carry this, what's basically called the modified D genome. But basically it's introducing more diversity for selection in the different environments that are around the world, and for quality as well. And so to date there are 80 of these wheat varieties, these synthetic wheats, have been released worldwide. So it was a big program and a huge crossing which you could only do in a place like Sinnet, Mexico, and they've really are proving to be very successful. Okay, so complementing that in terms of the, if you like, the wheat family, the tree, and also all the other crops, there were, during this period of just using that timeline, you have advances in looking after the soil, precision agriculture, and management issues, and as we've just heard this morning, the storage of the grain, which is something I'm particularly keen on as well. Okay, so present day. We have, this is just a snapshot of what's happening with nerdies like me interested in the DNA of the crops. You can produce, this is a pictorial image of fingerprints for the whole genome. So what's very powerful, these are, for your information, these different colours are just indicating different single base changes that are differing between the reference genome, which is called Chinese Spring. And so when it's all down below the maize and Westonia, they're basically hardly any different from the reference genome. And then Lancer and Shuyan are very different. The bottom line is you can identify these fingerprints for regions. So for a long time, we were sort of trying to use single genes, if you like, to track the complex traits that everyone in the farm industry knows that are sort of complex to deal with. Here we can actually look at regions and actually track phenotype, fingerprints to track the phenotypes. And just to give you a reality check here, in Australia we do these large large national trials, and we looked at the group in AgriBio here in Victoria looked at almost 700 lines doing this. So this is already now a small scale. We can do it at a much larger scale. And they found that there are two major fingerprints, which are H1 and H2, which I've indicated up there, which are in this region where I reckoned there was a gene that was affecting the yield enormously. And in fact, that whole region where this gene is, the one I've indicated up there, there was over this trial which is in the field, it's all sort of dealing with real life situations. The H2 phenotype, which is the one that's the two down below, was clearly had a big advantage, and in terms of what breeders have been selecting in their extensive trials, and then it turned up in these national trials. The interesting thing out of this, there's an H3 phenotype, the one in grey there, which actually out-yielded the H1 and H2, but it hasn't been really selected for. There was probably some associated defects associated with that phenotype. So this is just to sort of give you an idea of what's happening. And in Victoria, you've got here the Department of Agriculture. Matt Hayden's running in charge of that group, where they've got the big grant from the GRDC, which is now looking at the entire Australian grain collection in Horsham at this level. So you can actually just start to really do some. If you find a particular trait in one of the wild germplasm they have, you can then do the fingerprint analysis and track it into your system of interest. And this applies both to yield and to grain quality, which is more an area that I'm interested in, and nutrition, which has already been mentioned here. Okay, so just to let you know that I'm not just on wheat. So I went into Matt's office and asked him, can you give me an example of chickpea for this meeting? And it turns out that this whole technology is now giving is being used by commercial companies to really select for genetic diversity. Again, it's going back to that out of the wild germplasm, which is giving the high protein levels. And there's also big programs. This is a really challenging disease in chickpea, the ascochydi. And it's, again, in the wild germplasm. Nature's done it all before. We're limited in what we can do with genetic engineering because society doesn't want us to fiddle in the lab with our crops. But in fact, nature's done it all before. So if we know what to look for now, particularly with these DNA fingerprints, we can get the material prepared. So just to finish up and basically lead into what Anna's going to talk about, this is from the wheat side of things. If you're inspired to get a low FODMAP wheat, the region of the chromosome has actually got 8 of these genes coding for the fructan levels in the grain. And so it's not just a simple matter of just going in and mutagenizing, because if one's gone, the other 7 will kind of compensate. And so there's a real challenge there of using, again, natural variation, which has got either the whole locus missing or different numbers missing, and doing a concerted effort to produce wheats, which you can then sort of look at from it can see if it can complement what you'll hear from Anna. As I say, genetic engineering, you could do this by genetic engineering very simply, but the product just isn't accepted to society. So the DNA fingerprint technologies could now be designed to really select for these changes and get the varying numbers of genes. Okay, so I guess we'll have questions and discussion afterwards. Yep. So I'll hand over to Anna.
Hi everyone. I might just adjust that slightly. As Emily mentioned, I'm Anna. I'm a PhD student in Kate's lab. And today I'm going to be talking about fructans and some fun sourdough yeasts. So before I talk about the what of my presentation, I thought I'd talk a little bit about why I'm interested in this stuff. And it starts when I was a teenager. My older brother was diagnosed with Crohn's disease, which is a subset of irritable bowel syndrome, or IBS. And for people with IBS, some nutrients are not well absorbed in the gut. There's other things as well, but that leads to some fairly unpleasant gastrointestinal symptoms. And IBS affects about 10% of the world's population, which is a lot of people, so it's not an insignificant problem. One of the main interventions for things like IBS is they change your diet. So they say, don't eat this, do eat this. And my older brother was given a really long list of things that he could no longer eat. And one of them was onion and garlic. And I remember thinking as a teenager, oh, you know, it sucks for you, but I don't see how this is going to affect me. But of course, he still lived at home, so family meals were still a thing. And if you've ever tried to cook a family dinner without on any meal without onion and garlic, it's very hard. So the problem with onion and garlic for my brother is that it contains this carbohydrate called inulin. And inulin is actually part of an even bigger gang called the FODMAPs, which stands for fermentable oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monosaccharides, and polyols. And they are this group of dietary carbohydrates that trigger IBS symptoms in some people. And they're really common. They're in a lot of really common foods that you eat. So lots of dairy, some fruits, honey, pulses, grains, a lot of very healthy foods, really. So my brother is FODMAP intolerant. He can't have any of these, but he can still have bread, thank God. But he can only have one kind of bread, and it's only this Edwards spelt sourdough. He loves it. It's his favourite thing on the planet. So why this bread? The first is that spelt grains, spelt flour, is lower in total FODMAPs than rye and wheat flour. And the other part of the equation with this bread is that it's a sourdough. And the sourdough fermentation pushes the FODMAP content even lower, so much so that this can be considered a low FODMAP product. So why, I guess, why spelt and not other things? The answer is fructans are the main FODMAP that's found in bread. They're in the blue. Depending on the type of flour that you use or the type of bread it is, they are typically the largest contributor to FODMAP content. There are others, as you can see here, there are other fructans, but, FODMAPs. Both start with F, it's too hard. There are other FODMAPs, but for IBS people, fructans are the main obstacle to eating bread. This is what they look like. Oh, pardon me. You can see that wheat fructans and inulin look very similar. Well, I guess they are very similar. The main difference is that inulin is usually one big, long, straight chain, whereas fructans are very branched, so they tend to be more like a tree relative to compared to a stick. So with these kinds of products, so we've got spelt sourdough, and then there's also this low FODMAP flour. You could consider this job done, and for my brother it kind of is. The problem with these solutions is that they're very expensive, especially the low FODMAP flour. And that's hopefully where sourdough yeasts come in, to maybe offer an alternative that might not be any better, but it would be an alternative, and it could maybe be cheaper, which would be good. This graph shows us the FODMAP composition of different white wheat breads made with different techniques. So we've got a ciabatta, a standard bread, and then we've got sourdough. And what you can see is that the FODMAP profile of the sourdough bread is quite different from the FODMAP profile of the other two styles of bread. And notably that the fructans in green are much lower in the sourdough bread than they are in the other two types. We assume that this is because of the way sourdough is made. And we can categorise some of the differences between sourdough bread making and standard bread making into sort of some broad categories. And one of those categories relates essentially to how long we let bread ferment for. If you look at it from a certain direction, you can consider the part of a sourdough starter that's added to dough to make it to be basically like really, really pre-fermented dough. And the other thing is that sourdough bread tends to be proofed for longer. Not always, but it tends to be proofed for longer than standard bread. So all of that adds up to us letting bread ferment for longer. And we already know that just extending proofing time in standard bread allows us to lower dough fructan content. So in this case, this group of researchers, they fermented something for 4.5 hours, and you can see that the fructans in the green go down over time. And the interesting thing is that they also found that was true regardless of whether you use bread wheat or spelt. Obviously the spelt starts at a lower point, but there's still a decrease. And we think, well, the most logical assumption here is that what we're doing is giving the fermenting microbes a longer window in which to make changes to the dough. That's not the whole picture though. It's not just that we're giving the yeasts more time, it's that in sourdough it's a different cohort of microorganisms altogether. When you would make a standard bread, you'd use a pure industrial Saccharomyces cerevisiae strain, whereas sourdough bread tends to contain 1 or 2 yeast species and 1 to several bacterial species. You'll notice that Saccharomyces is on the list of sourdough yeast species, and they do naturally occur there, but we've also got some other cool, fun, exotic-looking names, as well as a bunch of lactic acid bacteria whose contribution shouldn't be understated. We know all of this because there's quite a body of research into sourdoughs worldwide. This is a map of the world with every country coloured by how many types of sourdough products it has, and Italy is by far and away the sourdough kings of the world. They have 71 types of sourdough products. I think it's because they have a lot of sweet sourdough-based things. But this also serves as kind of a reflection of the global interest and work that's being done in sourdoughs. You can see that there's quite a bit of activity in Europe, some in Asia and North America, but Australia remains stubbornly purple. So the contribution, our small contribution to maybe filling that gap, is that students and researchers like me from Kate's lab, we've been looking at sourdoughs from Victoria and southeastern Australia for a little while. There's quite a lot of us down in the corner. We've looked at 35 sourdough starters, and we usually get, as I mentioned before, we usually only get 1 yeast, sometimes 2 out of a starter. And all of the species that we've got are on the right in the green. As you can see, we have a lot of Saccharomyces cerevisiae. We find that a lot in sourdoughs, and we also have quite a few Kazakhstania and Pekia yeasts. The starters that we have in red are ones that we've actually made ourselves in the lab from a variety of different grains. And we've tested quite a few. We've gone from sort of varieties of wheat all the way to things like brown rice and millet and teff. But the ones in blue are ones that we've taken from bakeries and starters sourced from across Victoria, which you can see on this map. There's not really a pattern to which species are found where. If there is a pattern, we would need so much more data to see it, I think. But you can see that there's quite a concentration of spots over Melbourne just because that's where we are. But yeah, it's just really cool to see. What I'm interested in is whether maybe we can use some of these interesting Victorian sourdough yeasts to make low FODMAP bread. There's already work being done on using yeast to lower the FODMAP content of bread elsewhere. This is the work of a group of Belgian researchers who have looked at this yeast called Cluveromyces marxianus. And what they found was that over 3 hours, this yeast is able to reduce, or it's able to get rid of over 90% of the fructan content in wholemeal flour. You can see it in the blue on the right, which is quite something because wholemeal flour is higher fructan than white flour. This yeast is special because it produces an enzyme called inulinase, which, as the name suggests, is very good at breaking down inulin, and by extension, similar molecules, if you remember, like fructans. And it sort of breaks them down into their subunits. There's another group of researchers in Ireland who are looking at a different yeast called Lachantia fermentati. So we've got all of these different bread FODMAPs in the different panels, and Lachantia is up the top and baker's yeast is down the bottom. That's their comparison. The cool result, obviously, here is the fructan panel in the top right. The bread made with Lachantia fermentati is about half the fructan of baker's yeast bread. And as an extra bonus, they also found that the bread they made with this yeast was able to meet established low FODMAP cutoff values. So that's a very special one. I'm not interested in either of those because I'm going to be different. I ignore all of the green and red writing. I'm interested in a group of yeasts called Kazakhstania that's sort of a distant cousin of Leschantia and Cluveromyces. You can see it up there in the orange. It is named after Kazakhstan. That's usually the first question I get about it. The first yeast from that genus was isolated there. And among the sourdough yeasts, it's actually quite a big deal for a obscure sounding yeast. From sourdoughs worldwide, 7 different species have been isolated, which actually makes it the best represented yeast genus in sourdough. So we know that sourdough is low in fructans, or lower in fructans. We know that Kazakhstania is a very common sourdough yeast and that it has some special relatives. But no one's considered whether it might be a good tool for reducing the fructan content of bread. So that's what I'm interested in looking at. The first thing that we did here is look at a big family tree of this genus. So this is every species in the genus. There are about 52. And we've just indicated the ones that are associated with sourdoughs or breads with a red spot, and the ones that are not with the blue triangle. And what we noticed is that the Kazakhstania yeasts associated with sourdoughs, not all of them, but most of them, tend to cluster together in the middle in this little clade. And that maybe tells us that they have some shared genetic character that maybe is part of why they're good sourdough yeasts, and that shared genetic character could be useful to me. We did something similar, but this time not looking at the yeasts themselves, but at the enzymes they make. So this is the sugar breakdown enzymes of a bunch of bread yeasts. And we wanted to see not just, I guess, how similar the yeasts themselves were, but how similar the tools they have were. And again, we found that the enzymes that Kazakhstania yeasts produced are most similar to other Kazakhstania enzymes. So again, that suggests that there's something about these little machines that is similar and maybe unique to this genus. So now we test that. We have a collection of 29 Kazakhstania yeasts, two different species, and for these tests we also had included some baker's yeast and some Cluveromyces marxianus as positive controls. To do that, we made some agar that has everything that yeast needs to grow except for a carbohydrate, and then we just add the carbohydrate, the one carbohydrate we're interested in. We put a bit of yeast on that agar and then we wait. If we see that there's nothing after waiting a little bit, then we just assume that it can't grow at all and we give it a 0. Whereas if you see this kind of really bold, opaque growth on the right, we assume it can use that carbohydrate and we give it a 1. These are the carbohydrates that we tested in ascending order of size from left to right. So we obviously tested nothing because we're good scientists and we use negative controls. We've got our little monosaccharides, some slightly bigger ones, and then our big inulin and wheat starch. We couldn't actually use bread fructans, that would be ideal, but they are very hard, I know now, to isolate from flour, and inulin is a good enough substitute for the purposes of the experiment. So this enormous graph is the growth scores of every yeast. So the growth scores are on the y-axis on the left, sorted by the starter that they came from up the top, and the growth carbohydrate on the right. And the only thing that I want you to see from this graph is that if you have multiple yeasts of the same species from the same starter, they more or less behave the same. So that tells us that we're probably dealing with the same yeast, just copies or clones of it. So if we reduce the noise and just look at one species from each starter. On glucose and fructose, every yeast is happy as a clam. Regardless of whether it's a positive control or not, they are all just thrilled to be there. When you get to inulin, though, that's when things get a little bit more interesting. What we found, surprisingly, obviously the Cluveromyces, which makes inulinase, is going fine. The Kazakhstania is not as much, but the Kazakhstania boulderi in the red doesn't grow as well as the Kazakhstania humilis in the green. So Now we also have to consider that maybe there's a species-specific property of inulin or fructan degradation that we have to consider, but we weren't expecting to find that, so that was really cool. And just to show you what I saw on the plates, the yeasts outlined in red are the Bellarine, and you can hopefully see what I saw, which is that they definitely are not as happy as the others. There's so much more that we don't know about this genus. It's a very big genus, if you remember the family tree, and there's lots still to be looked at. Having something like Crohn's disease, I know from my big brother, is an illness with a significant burden on your quality of life. And it would be really cool if some of these sourdough yeasts that have been kind of under our noses for thousands of years, I think, it would be really cool if some of those were able to provide a solution. Thanks.
That's a hard act to follow, isn't it? Well done, Anna. Thank you. I just want to wrap up this presentation from people at the university with a few other considerations about sourdough microbiology, including the role of bacteria. So I love the idea of community, and I think GrAiNZ emulates all of those wonderful qualities of a real community that comes together. It's, they talk, they speak, they're dynamic, and they work with one another. But this, of course, also happens in a sourdough starter. We wonder where yeasts come from a sourdough starter, and I've had several conversations over these past few days of where they come from. We don't always know, actually. They are likely to come from the hands of the baker, from the in-house microbiota, but also from the flour, potentially also water as well. But this slide demonstrates that you've got this daily feeding routines or even weekly feeding routines, however your baking regime works. You activate and you cultivate a dynamic collection of microbes with one another. And we've got some beautiful electron micrographs, a picture that I stole from our colleague Delphine Sicard, which shows you yeast and lactic acid bacteria growing in a, with wheat starch in a sourdough starter there on the right. Anna's alluded to all of the different yeasts and yeasts that we've seen, and I wanted to introduce another level of this with a global study that we've published to collate all of those yeasts together. You'll see that on the donut here, the bigger colour of the donut is its abundance, and Saccharomyces cerevisiae is the major part there. But as Anna has told us, the Kazakhstani yeasts and the sort of greeny colours there are also important, along with a wide range of other yeasts as well. What I wanted to introduce into this conversation today was the role of bacteria. And a very difficult to read table up there in the top right-hand corner shows that there's approximately 50 or so species of bacteria that have also been isolated from sourdough starters. And so work that we're doing in the lab is to try and understand the interactions between these yeasts and bacteria together in the fermentation, to understand how this impacts what we see in the loaves of bread that we love to eat and enjoy. I wanted to highlight and embarrass, I can see him laughing uncomfortably at the back, the sourdough starters that Chris Stafferton was kind enough to donate to science. You'll be familiar with Chris's work on making absolutely amazing gluten-free sourdough bread with his book Promise and Fulfilment, and I'm sorry I don't have the full title there, Chris, but you are welcome to approach him later to ask about this. Chris, this was pre-pandemic. He hand-delivered some starters that he has cultivated in his work using different gluten-free grains, so quinoa or buckwheat, brown rice, millet and teff. We wanted to know what was in there, so we, as Anna's alluded, we go ahead and we isolate them. This is one of Anna's slides again, and we see them in their colonies on a plate, and there we can identify what they are through looking at their DNA. you'll see a wide range of very complicated names. On the bottom row there, you'll see all of the bacteria. They're smaller than yeast. They are numerically dominant in a sourdough starter. So in an active starter, you might have about 100 to 1 cells of bacteria to yeast, but of course that dynamic changes during the fermentation. And of course, all of Anna's favourite Kazakhstania friends are indicated there as well. In the lab at the University of Melbourne, we've got a wide range of really exciting facilities to be able to understand this in a way. So we take Anna's isolates, other students in the lab's isolates, and we can cultivate those in a laboratory, so we're assured that they are a pure culture of that particular yeast or bacteria. Then we make dough out of them. We bake little pups. I think bakers have laughed at us for how cute and little our tiny little loaves are. But then we can present them to a sensory panel and say to the sensory panel, well, you know, is this different? Is this, do you prefer the flavour of this or that? We can test to see the nutritional quality, the structural quality, the flavours of these different breads. And of course, you'll find people will flock to the corridor as soon as they smell the baking loaves come out of the oven in the hope to get a free little leftover piece of bread to take home. So Anna has talked about the use of yeast to make FODMAP-friendly bread, and I wanted to highlight some work that we've been doing looking at other species that we've isolated from Chris Stafferton's starters. Wickerhammeromyces anomalus, which is there on the left, and Pichia fermentans, which is there on the right. And we've been using a lactobacillus strain in partnership. We've done this work in teff and in buckwheat flour. A complicated slide to impress you all on how sciencey we can be. But what this slide shows us is very similar to what Anna showed. We have along the graph, we've got time of fermentation. So time of fermentation is incredibly important. And we have, by colour, the different dough treatments. So we have a wheat dough by itself on the top line there. We have teff dough in the middle and buckwheat at the bottom. And then as the fermentation progresses, we can see what happens to the total fructans during the fermentation. We have the dough by itself. We also have yeasts and bacteria together. And so you can see in some cases, and here I draw your attention to the top line, that by the end of fermentation, after 24 hours of fermentation, you can see that Wickerhammeromyces and lactobacillus dramatically reduce the amount of fructans that are present in bread. Of course, in teff and buckwheat are naturally low in FODMAPs to begin with, but still we see a reduction, particularly in the teff loaves, as the fermentation proceeds. So we have naturally an ecological system which can interact with one another to decrease the amount of fructans in bread to hopefully develop breads which are accessible financially, flavour-wise are fantastic, but are also nutritionally dense for people who can't otherwise eat them. So I'll wrap up this session, and we're hoping very much to have a vibrant Q&A in the end. We've found that Australian sourdough starters have diverse populations of yeast and bacteria. The yeast and bacteria that we find are similar to those isolates, so the same species that are found elsewhere in the world. We should see our sourdough starters as more than to just leaven and produce carbon dioxide. We should see our sourdough starters as a really a complex community that we need to cultivate and to encourage to be able to transform this raw dough into a fermented product that can be baked into bread, which is delicious and flavoursome and nutritionally dense. And we need to consider this as an ecosystem. So interactions between yeast and bacteria together can have more of an effect than one yeast alone. So diversity, as always, is key. Of course, the first acknowledgement is Chris, who generously donated his starters to science, the many people we've had through the lab who've done the work, and to you, thank you for listening. We would be very happy to take some questions here, and this can be to any of the three speakers. Rudy, would you be comfortable up here on a stool? Anna, maybe you'd like to come up as well, and we could use the microphone.
Should we try and not obscure?
Oh, it's all right. We don't need to see that anymore, do we? Uncomfortable photographs of us in the tea room. Are there any questions we can ask? Jason?
That was fantastic, thank you. Just got a few questions about quality, how it's defined, and why this kind of work is not part of our quality definition. And what is the barrier to both having a genetic and processing response across our agriculture to having better, I guess having a FODMAP work? Like, is it just funding, or have we got a narrow definition, or what would rather?
Do you want to respond first, Rudy?
So you're talking about the quality of the grain or the flour that's milled?
Well, yeah. We'll start with the grain.
Yeah. So a lot of the grain in Australia's export goes for export, and the exporters are really, in my experience anyway, are keen on taking shortcuts, so they're not too keen on the quality testing. That's just has been my experience. It's been disappointing. So the quick and dirty tests are what's done. With the developments in agrobio, certainly we're capable of now doing more accurate quality testing, and it's really just to get to a point where, in the end, it costs, obviously, but I think there's a lot of exciting stuff happening where you can get fingerprints for your different material that will then let you say this belongs to this category, and particularly specialty wheats that are more suitable for what you're looking for. There's an incredible amount of material. There's the on the health front in CSIRO, where I was for a lot of my life. There's wheats are being produced that are high amylose, you know, they're sort of like the maize equivalent, and they're just there. They're not being exploited. So it's from a invisible fibre sort of idea. Some of these are really valuable. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but it's sort of, you know, it's in the end it's costs, but there's a lot of things happening. With spectral analyses that people are now starting through the DNA analyses, the NIR type analyses are starting to, I've always been a bit sceptical about them, but they're starting to have being able to get more meaning from them as well.
What's the barrier to investment though from industry to make this happen?
I think I'll just speak up.
Yeah.
I think the exporters are a different world, and they dominate our grain, and so that then drives the breeding programs to produce certain things on a large scale, which then comes to people like yourself. You're really you're not in control of what you get at the genetic level. That is, yeah. There's a lot of environmental things that can be done as well, but I found the grain exporters are quite, they work to a different the beat of a drum. Yeah. So that it's the question. The answer to your question is that there are genuine. The business model for grain exporters really stop you from really driving a lot of this innovative research into defining your product carefully.
Okay. Go ahead.
In the back catalogue, there's a few weeks of the British cadenza fermenter and a few others like
Yeah.
pre-spelt has a higher ease of digestion, I suppose.
Yeah.
Is there particular markers that you have that you can search for in the database for
to match?
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. There are regions which are based on some, like the work that Anna's doing, which gives you some parameters to aim for. So the answer is yes, and the properties of the starch, for example, are one. The levels of there's a whole range of enzymes which are important in producing the starch, the amount of branching and all that sort of thing. So the answer is yes, the knowledge is there for defining both at the protein level, which is what I used to work with, and all the different products that are correlated with quality, and then also but the starch is the main component, and then there's a lot of the minor component-wise, like the fructans and the arabinoxylans, which are involved in water absorption, which again the technologies are now there to provide you the diagnostic, which is becoming cheaper. And I think, as I say, I'm now in agribio part of my time, and it's very exciting to see that research level of the Department of Ag here in Victoria.
Sorry, I have two very quick questions. With the sourdough starter, the bacteria and yeasts, do you see or expect the populations to change over time, or is it a fairly constant? And second half is, with the fermentation time, is temperature a factor?
Maybe you should talk about your honours work, about how things are stable over time.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
The answer to your first question is... sure, yeah. So the first question was about whether the kind of relationships between sourdough yeasts and bacteria change over time, if I got that right. And the second was about, we talked about time of fermentation being a factor with fructan content, and the question was whether temperature is as well. So for the first, the answer is that sourdough ecosystems tend to stabilise over time, and there are actually quite a lot of studies looking at, I think the term they usually use is the succession of, they talk about waves of, we have, this stage dominated by this bacterium and this yeast, but which yeast and which bacterium and how much and whatever, that depends on the individual circumstances, but they do tend to find their own set point. And I spent time in honours every day coming into the lab. I made a kind of an artificial synthetic ecosystem in little plates that I subcultured or backslopped every day. And yet I found that the numbers of yeasts and bacteria tended to level out over time, and they tended to find their groove partnership-wise very quickly. They tended to just, yeah. The second one, about temperature being a factor, the answer is probably. I haven't read anything directly about it, but I can't imagine it not being a factor. I'll pass over to Kate.
Yeah. A microbiologist might say that every microbe has got its optimal growth temperature, and so that is set by the conditions where you maintain your starter. You would be unknowingly selecting for microbes that grow particularly well at whatever happens in your bakery or in your home or whatever it is. And so over time, even if the ambient temperature goes up and down a little bit, you'll be selecting for communities that can deal with that and can maintain that balance. Something we haven't spoken about today is that yeast and bacteria need one another. They need one another to coexist during this fermentation. Yeasts are not very good at breaking down carbohydrates, generally speaking. They're very good at taking up sugars, so simple sugars, as Anna's seen. But they're very good at letting go of nitrogen. So they'll produce the amino acids that they need, but others will just overflow out of their cell. Bacteria, on the other hand, are something called fastidious. As Gabrielle was talking this morning, they're the fussy eaters. They can't make all of their amino acids, so they get them from the yeasts. In return, bacteria tend to have a wider range of enzymes that they can secrete to break down carbohydrate, which the yeasts use. So you get this sort of circular dependency. So they do need one another, and so regardless of temperature, you would be selecting for them in this balance. I'm sure they will all be aware of cases where your sourdough, you don't get a proper leaven or rising when it's very humid or it's very hot or whatever, but generally speaking, you've selected for it unknowingly.
I just want to have mic privileges for 1 second. I just want to apologise to Chris Stafferton for falsely claiming that we made some of your sourdoughs. I was subtly corrected from Kate's slide. Sorry. Not all of them, some of them were us, but most of them are Chris Stafferton, so credit goes to him.
And now Chris gets a question.
Okay, question. Similar to Simon's question, but just a spin on that. The communities that establish of yeast and bacteria, if they establish on one substrate and you change the substrate, is that going to move the makeup of the community?
Maybe is the answer. The answer is I don't really know, but what we do have is observational. I was pretty sure when I started out that the same starters in the same bakery would have the same communities in them. But that isn't true, as we know from your starters, Chris, but also from the Tivoli Road starter, which was one of the first starters I looked at. And Anna, I was reflecting the map of where we get our starters from is basically where I go on holidays. And I introduced myself to bakers and asked if we can look at their sourdoughs. Tivoli Road... Yeah. Soon, just soon. So Tivoli Road, when Michael and Pippa were running, it was one of the first starters that I looked at, and we took a sample of a wheat-based starter and a rye-based starter, and the bakers were busy and it was all a bit uncomfortable, and they gave us this enormous package of it and it was like, oh, we only need like 1 gram, and it was, a bit confusing. But what we found is that there were different communities in the wheat starter than there were in the rye starter. And I thought that was unexpected. I would have thought that it's just, a baker's hands mixing up this one, they might also mix up that one, and there would be exchange. But because of that and because of your starters, Chris, we know that that's probably not true, and that the wheat or the flour that we're using selects for the community that is established. Just on the left there, the hand there.
I've got 3 questions. Can you identify yeast under a microscope? And if not, can we send out starters for you to be analysed?
Please do.
And the Kazakhstania genus that you're interested in.
Sorry, I think that's me.
Would that be able to just be used in isolation in a home sourdough starter, or would airborne yeasts and other things get into that community?
Maybe I'll repeat the question. So the first question was, can we identify yeasts under a microscope and can they be sent to us? And the answer is kind of for the first one. We tend to take a little bit of their DNA and sequence that, and we get a more accurate read on what they are, just because maybe you noticed on the slide that Kate had with the photos of the yeast is that they often look quite alike. So identifying them by what they look like is not always the best way to go. But yes, please send them to us. We make the map bigger. With the Kazakhstania humilis, it's, I think after Saccharomyces cerevisiae, it's the most common yeast in sourdoughs. Was your question whether if you bought a pure culture of it, you could use it, or would it be the only? Right.
Purposes, you know, could you grow it at home, and would it become? Does it need, like, because you were just saying how bacteria and yeast really need each other, and I imagine the whole community is all they're all doing bits. So, how do you keep that isolated?
You wouldn't, and that you probably wouldn't. You wouldn't want to keep it isolated. Kazakhstania humilis kind of has like a tiny best friend, and it's one of the lactic acid bacteria called. It's named after San Francisco. It's Fructolactobacillus sanfranzisensis, and they have this like really. It's actually, I mean, I don't know if you would call it famous, but among sourdough research, it's a well-known co-occurrence. So usually where you find Kazakhstania humilis, you usually find the bacterium as well. And you wouldn't really want to split them up because, as Kate said, they need each other. And actually, it's good that you mentioned that, because the work that Emily mentioned, I'm going to Delphine Sicard's lab. I'm so excited. The work that I'm doing there is looking at the partnership between Kazakhstania humilis and its little friend to see whether, I just don't want to say the name again, it's too long, to see whether, to see what the mechanism of their partnership is.
In terms of the other yeasts that are in the community, you have to keep the Kazakhstania kind of the most abundant in order for it to be kind of FODMAP useful, if that makes sense.
It would be, I think that would only happen if a yeast company was prepared to make a single culture of Kazakhstania and sell it, which some of them seem to be ready to approach, because everyone's looking to find a niche yeast bacteria in humans and companies as well. And so there is some interest in producing interesting yeast commercially so that we can keep it sequestered, if you like, and just working. It would be extraordinarily difficult to do that in a home or bakery, because anytime there's something fermented, you'll see it yourself. You see the vinegar flies come in, the vinegar flies sit down and eat. They've got yeasts in their gut. They leave yeast there, they take them with them. You know, you wouldn't be able to keep a pure culture in that way. Is that finished? Okay. Thank you. I think we've got it. Oh, one more.
I was just going to ask a question. Now that the wheat breeding has been privatised in Australia, and we now get Roundup ready varieties that farmers get to use, and they also have farm-back royalties that they have to pay to the breeders of those wheats, is there any attention being paid to actually breeding varieties that are more beneficial for organic growing practices and flavour rather than just pure volume of yield?
Yield is still the big driver, but it's been terrific to see Intergrain in Perth actually have made quite a big investment with AgriBio here in Victoria to produce the DNA sequence-based analyses of all their varieties. And so that's a start to try and deal with your challenge. And if there are particular features of the grain or of the genetic material that's advantageous for organic growing, then they could select it. And if there's a big market, a specialty market.
Is there any incentive for that to be happening in the breeding industry, or is it still more focused purely on volume production?
This is part of this business model I mentioned before with the export grains. But I'm finding the group in Perth are particularly good in sort of making those investments which are sort of publicly available. The AGT in Adelaide is a bit more sort of inward looking and they don't do that sort of investment, but certainly I think the will is there, but the driver is sort of, the business models just aren't there at the moment.
Thanks, Rudy. All right, everybody, join me in thanking very much these fantastic scientists.
Thank you.